Okay, we're at about just over 200 participants. It's 12:03, so I'm hoping that we'll see others join, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So as we do with all union meetings, please rise at home and join me in a pledge to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Okay. I'm John Holden, your District 751 President and DBR. I want to thank you all for attending today. We are here to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of women in America winning the right to vote. This was a powerful victory that happened then. We will celebrate those that were at the center of this issue and how they fought for justice, not just at the ballot box, but in their community and in our country. This opened up opportunities for women to use their voice and have a say in what kind of society we would live in. While this was a victory, there was much more to do, especially for people of color who did not enjoy the same right in communities all over the country. And today we will hear from our top union leadership of the IAM, General Vice President Gary Allen, International President Robert Martinez Jr. We have top leadership from the National AFL-CIO with Secretary-Treasurer Liz Shuler and Secretary-Treasurer of the Washington State Labor Council, April Sims. We are also excited to be joined by acclaimed author and human rights activist Bill Fletcher. Thanks for joining us today, Bill. We will engage in discussion about voting rights, voter suppression tactics. Most importantly, we will be inspired to get to work during the upcoming election cycle to make a difference. What you're going to learn about today was put together as an effort to reinforce the understanding that if we don't use our power at the ballot box, we give our power away to those that are not looking out for working people, those that are not raising the standard of living for all, and frankly, those that don't stand for racial and economic justice. I hope that what we learned today motivates us to get involved in making sure others know how important it is to use our voice, our influence, and cast our vote to be heard. We know elections make all the difference in the world. Following this presentation, Bill Fletcher has graciously offered to discuss the recent protests against police brutality and racial injustice. So please stay tuned through the whole presentation. Okay, now for our first speaker. I am very proud and honored to introduce our General Vice President, Gary Allen. Gary was initiated into IAM Local 794 in 1979 upon his employment at the General Electric aircraft engine plant in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Gary served in many leadership positions throughout his career. He became president and DBR of Local 794, became a Grand Lodge representative in the Western Territory, became the Western Territory organizing leader, and then moved on to the aerospace coordinator at the International. He became chief of staff for the Western Territory before being elected as the General Vice President of the Western Territory in 2009, where he has led our members with his heart, his belief in God, family, people, and his passion for social justice as a guiding force in his life. So I was fortunate when I became president of District 751 that Gary was there to work with me and support our district through some of our hardest years as a union. He supported us and helped us lead others in understanding the value of our Membership Bill of Rights, which District 751 submitted and was later passed at the 2016 Grand Lodge Convention. Gary has impacted our union in all the right ways and has kept the focus on representing our members with the principles of growth, prosperity, and strength. Gary commands respect and demands high standards of the representatives under his guidance. Gary will stand shoulder to shoulder with us in fighting for justice and equality for all. As I said, I'm proud to introduce Gary, and I'm also thankful that he could address us during our conference. So please welcome General Vice President Gary Allen.
Thank you, John. First and foremost, I I give all glory to God, and I thank God for the many blessings that have been bestowed upon me, my family, and my union. Thank you for that kind introduction and those kind sentiments, John. I really appreciate it, and the feeling is mutual. I just want to say that, this young man took the helm when it was not easy to take the helm. And him and his team have rebuilt this district and have refortified and reinstituted the principles of 751. And my hat's off to you, John, Sue, Richard, and the entire staff. You've done a marvelous job, and for that, I am eternally grateful to you and your people, brother. So I want to start by just thanking all the veterans in the room, in the virtual room that we're in. This is a new experience for me, so I'm going to refer to this as a room. I'd like to thank all those vets for all your sacrifice. What you did in your service to this great country enables all of us to speak freely and to enjoy our rights. I'd like to thank the stewards and the officers that are in the room for all the work you do every single day. I know that you are the union on the shop floor, and I know that you are the person or the persons that exact justice for our members. And for that, I am very, very appreciative. I was reflecting on what I was going to say today. I started doing a little research, and I just looked at the whole concept of voting. And, I just want to say that there have been many, many sacrifices. The sacrifice of laying someone's life down for our ability to vote. The 15th Amendment, which was passed in 1870, gave Black men the right to vote. And it was almost 50 years later, in 1920, that the 19th Amendment was passed that gave women the right to vote. In 1924, Native Americans gained the right to vote. And 30 years later, in 1944, Asian Americans finally received the sacred right to vote. So I want to make sure that I urge everyone this November to go out and do your duty as a citizen of this country. And brothers and sisters, I'm not going to mince words. I'm just going to come straight at it because that's who I am. We need to have a change in administration. We need to have a takeover of the Senate. And we need to put some people in the House that really will fight for our interests. And I just want to give you a few reasons as why this is so important at this juncture. We're at a crossroads in this country, brothers and sisters. And we have a vision of hope and happiness and prosperity, or we have a vision of hate and discontent and separation. And I choose the first path, brothers and sisters. And, I'm going to come at this from a different point of view. I'll skip some of the moral things. I'll just, I won't talk about how he demeans women. I'll, not talk about how he urges people to drink Clorox or calling white supremacists very fine people. I'll focus on how his administration and this government has been engaged in abject union busting. Politics have consequences not only to our society, but to our union. When we have a good administration, it helps us do our job better. When we have a union busting administration, as we do now currently, it makes it harder. My time is short, so I'm just gonna give you two examples. Under the Obama administration, we had some rules that were changed around NLRB elections. When someone wants a union, it's been much more streamlined under Obama. He put rules in that get us to elections quicker and make anti-union tactics less effective. And, I can tell you, personally attest that in this territory, when those rules went into place, we almost doubled our organizing efforts, brothers and sisters. And if you remember a couple of years back, this union was recognized for being the #1 organizing union in the AFL-CIO. And there's a reason for that. It's not only our program and our effort, it's because of the structure that we were engaging in. It was much easier to take people from filing a petition to an election. Now this administration is trying to abolish those rules. Thank God a court has blocked them so far, but they want to come after those rules because they know that it'll revitalize this labor movement. Service Contract Act. We do a lot of work in the Service Contract Act. And President Obama put in an executive order that gave incumbent employees the first right of refusal. Now that may sound not like much, but it's huge when you look at it from the point of view of union representation. Right now, the law of the land says if you do not retain 50% plus one of your employees, they don't have to recognize a union. So what this rule did is it absolutely guaranteed our incumbency there as a labor union, and we didn't leave people behind because of a federal contractor change. Those are just two issues that I can cite. There's many, many more about what this administration has done in terms of union busting. Let's move to economics. You know, this coronavirus, COVID-19, whatever you want to call it, has stripped bare and put on display for everybody the abject inequality of the economic and healthcare system of this country. People of color are dying at a much more dramatic rate than white people, my friends. I'm sorry to say. They are dying because they don't have access to healthcare, and it's not a right, it's a privilege in this country, and we need to change that. Now, this administration right now is in court trying to undo Obamacare. They'll pull out, you know, they'll throw 25 million people out on the street without health care. The scourge that women in this country get paid 80 cents on the dollar of a man is inexcusable, my friends. This has to be eradicated to its core. That takes place across our economy, except when we have a union contract. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention 45's complete lack of compassion and empathy for the murder of George Floyd. Anyone who can look at that video and not come away very, very affected is lacking a basic tenet of humanity. He would, on the day that they put George in the ground, he chose not to say anything about it. And what did he do? He talked about conspiracy theories. It's time for him to go, brothers and sisters. I'm hopeful that, you know, as people see these, you know, images, and it's happening, you know, if you look out on the street right now, we have people of every race protesting over the inequity in police enforcement. And I have hope that we are going to have a change in November. As a labor union, we must stand and fight against any discrimination, regardless of race, religion, sexual orientation, or identification. We are all created by the same God, and we need to make sure that we have our human dignity. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal and that all are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what this country was founded on, and that's what we have to fight for in November. So I'm asking you all to examine the issues. And I'm not saying that Democrats are perfect, and I'm not saying all Republicans are bad, but we need a change in the paradigm of our politics, brothers and sisters. Corporate America and the wealthy have co-opted us and have hijacked our political system. And it's all about who has money and who can buy these people. We need to make sure that we put people in office that are held accountable, and we need to hold them accountable. If we don't get change, I don't care who we put there in November, we got to change those bums out and get somebody that knows what it is to be a working person in this country. It's not easy. And we all have this right, and it's your right to vote, brothers and sisters. So please go out. We'll be asking you for some help. And you have a great leadership team, and I'm sure they're going to engage you. And the best thing is you have all male voting. And, you know, that's a big scam that they're trying to peddle out in the media, that it's all about, you know, trying to make people go to polls. Well, that's all BS. Brothers and sisters, I'm heartened to see this conference. And I hope to be able to travel in the near future so I can get up there and see you firsthand. John, thank you for this opportunity to address your group. Thank you all. God bless and Godspeed all. Thank you.
Thank you, brother. Thank you, Gary. I really appreciate you joining us today and your words. So that gives me another opportunity and an honor to introduce our international president, Robert Martinez. As the 14th International President of the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, Bob Martinez inherits a legacy that spans the history of the North American labor movement, seasoned by his own 39-year union career. Martinez is committed to aggressively grow the union and protect the contracts and careers of nearly 600,000 active and retired IAM members. A U.S. Navy veteran, Martinez began his career in 1980 as a member of Local 776A in Fort Worth, Texas, after being hired as an aircraft assembler at Lockheed Martin's Fort Worth Division. From 1980 to 1994, Martinez served in various positions in his local lodge before being appointed in 1995 as a staff member in the IAM Safety and Health Department. In April 2002, he was appointed as a special representative and served in that capacity until joining the Executive Council in 2003 as the General Vice President assigned to the Southern Territory. Bob was elected to become the 14th International President of the IAM in 2016. So I want to tell you that Bob has been the leader that IAM 751 was looking for when he was elected as International President in 2016. He immediately reached out to me as DBR in our district, and that's when it mattered the most. He was able to restore a relationship of trust and has worked on our behalf ever since he entered the role of International President. Bob has made it a priority to work with our district on the issues impacting our members. I am inspired by his leadership. I believe in him. I know that he will carry us through whatever this union faces in the future. So please welcome International President Robert Martinez Jr. to address us at this conference. Go ahead, Bob.
John, I want to thank you for those words, the introduction, but more importantly, giving me the opportunity to join you and the rest of our brothers and sisters for this very important meeting. Nothing could be more important to me than being with you in person today. But given the new reality of COVID-19, it is still not a possibility. So while I am not with you physically, I am honored to be here with you virtually. I'm also honored to be speaking alongside my friend and colleague, Western Territory General Vice President Gary Allen, AFL-CIO Secretary Liz Shuler, Washington State Labor Council Secretary-Treasurer April Sims, and civil rights activist Bill Fletcher. I want to start off by saying thank you to everyone on District 751 staff, all of our shop stewards who are the backbone of this organization, and all of our members who care enough to be a part of this conversation. As the COVID-19 pandemic took place and took a hold of Puget Sound region, you kept your heads up, protected your families, and cared for one another. As the pandemic spread and Boeing and other companies shut down and then reopened, you and your district leadership developed and implemented plans to make sure that personal protective equipment was made available to our membership. And as the stomach-turning, heart-wrenching murder of George Floyd shot through the world, you stood and are standing steadfast, demanding justice, equality, and an end to racism and the systemic violence and hatred that is still too prevalent in our society today. I want to reiterate some of what I said recently in a message to our entire membership. Our nation has a long, long way to go on a march towards justice. We should all be angry that Americans, our own IAM brothers and sisters, go out into the world every day and have to experience racism and discrimination. But this time, as we speak right now, I, for the first time, feel a real change coming to our country. Why? One of the reasons is I see people of all races marching, speaking up and speaking out together for a better world. And they are demanding that justice finally be done. We're here today to turn those calls into action, to use our collective voices and our votes, our votes to make real lasting change, just like we have so many times in the history of our great union. And as we all know, the fighting machinists are the best when the going gets tough. And it certainly has been tough on all of us. So on behalf of each and every one of our Executive Council members and our entire membership, I say thank you for what you're doing today, and to all of our members at 751 and their families. I especially want to offer my thanks to your district president of 751, John Holden, for his leadership during these very troubled times. Our leaders in Seattle are being confronted with a number of different issues on a daily basis. I also want to thank the District 751 Human Rights, Labor History, Women's and Legislative Committee for putting together this conference on equality and the right to vote. It could not have come at a more crucial time in our nation's history. It is hard to believe that nearly 250 years after the birth of our nation, that we are still fighting for equality and the right to vote for everyone. This struggle goes to the very core of our democracy, forcing people to show up to the polls to exercise their right to vote and risk getting COVID-19, like what happened in Wisconsin, because the Republican-controlled legislature, when safer alternatives are available, is unconscionable. Taking people off voter rolls because they have a Spanish surname is simply un-American, brothers and sisters. And forcing people to wait in lines that stretch for hours because voting machines don't work, like in Georgia this week, again, strikes at the very heart of our democracy. I don't have to tell any of you that this is a challenging time for our union, our nation, and the entire world. We are fighting a pandemic that has threatened our lives and our livelihoods. Our own IAM brothers and sisters, and nobody knows this more than you in Seattle, have become infected with the virus and have lost their lives to this deadly disease. Myself and your council send our most heartfelt condolences to each and every family and your communities in Puget Sound that are affected by this pandemic. From day one, our top priority has been the health and safety and well-being of our membership, not only on the job, but off the job. We have mobilized our union at every level, including with District 751, to demand that every employer provide the necessary personal protective equipment to every worker, to properly sanitize all workplaces on a continuous basis, and to follow all CDC guidelines. We have been relentless in lobbying Congress to provide federal unemployment relief for the millions of our brothers and sisters that are out of work. We have made certain that companies that get relief give that relief to their workers instead of pocketing it for their CEOs and other executives. This is why we, along with your District 751 leadership, pushed through a $17 billion relief package for aerospace companies on the condition that they would not engage in layoffs. All of this work that we did was intended to give relief to District 751 members and our members in the Boeing supply chain. And as you know, at the end of the day, Boeing did not accept this offer after everything that we went to protect our membership. This is why we also pushed through a $25 billion relief package for airlines, also on the condition that they would not engage in layoffs. We continue fighting for passage of the next round of stimulus legislations known in the HEROES Act, which is stuck on Mitch McConnell's desk. We have been working around the clock on these and other initiatives to continue to protect our membership during these turbulent times. I have directed all of our staff at headquarters to mobilize every resource that we have to fight for every one of our members at both the federal and the state level. That said, there is much work to be done, and you can be sure that we will be keeping a very, very close eye on the actions of Boeing and every employer during this crisis. Take, for example, United Airlines. As you know, we represent the majority of all the employees at United Airlines. Well, United took the relief money and then announced it was going to be reducing workers to part-time status, taking away a significant portion of their pay and their benefits. United's actions were a clear violation of their sacred promise to retain workers under the Relief Act. Well, as you know, we did not sit back and we did not let them get away with it. We immediately took United Airlines to court, and the day after we filed our lawsuit, United backed down. But the fight isn't over. The Trump administration might let non-unionized Delta cut their workers to part-time. It would not be surprising to me. This administration has gutted OSHA, the NLRB, and the Department of Labor at a time when workers need them the most. And if all of our elected officials in Washington, D.C. cared more about you than themselves, if more of them had the courage to stand up and fight for what is right and just, and if more of them stood up to the bully in the White House, we would not have to fight so hard all the time. But until everyone, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, disability, age, or national origin, has the right to vote, we will never have that kind of democracy that all Americans truly deserve. And we all truly deserve this justice, equality, and love that are so badly needed today. I, along with your entire executive council, will continue to fight alongside of you as long as we continue our battle against those who rather divide us than unite us. While we celebrate 100 years of women's right to vote, we cannot, we must not, and we will not wait another year, another month, or another day for the right to vote for all people. I know we have many strong, powerful IAM women with us today on this Zoom call. Each and every one of you are the embodiment in everything that sisters before us have fought for. By continuing to be engaged in your union, fighting to end gender pay gap and all forms of discrimination, you are continuing that march toward a more just workplace and world. You have an ally in myself, our council, and this entire union, because we know that women's rights are human rights. Under my watch, this union will never, ever be silent to any injustice, anywhere, to anyone. Like I said in a message to all IAM members last week, on the heels of the mass protest after the murder of George Floyd, an injustice to one is an injustice to all. We are seeing right now, what we are seeing right now is a 21st century national reckoning of generations of injustice. Just like the generations before us, The time has come for this generation of Americans to bend the arc of the moral universe towards justice. There is much more work left to be done, and the time for action is now. We will not rest, not now. The stakes are simply too high. We will not rest until every American can pursue the American dream. We will not rest until every American is free from racism and discrimination. Brothers and sisters, we will not rest until we answer the call of every American for the right to breathe without the knee of racism on their necks. We will continue marching, we will continue protesting, and we will continue our call for justice for George Floyd and the generations of Americans who have been denied their God-given rights because of who they are. No matter the color of their skin, no matter their gender, no matter who you love, no matter who you worship, this union will always fight for you. This union will always stand by your side. And this union will always be on the right side of history. We made some history of our own earlier this year, sisters and brothers. We did something that has never been done in the history of organized labor. We gave each and every member a voice, a vote, a real vote, in who the IAM endorsed for President of the United States. That initiative began right here in the Western Territory when a local lodge president asked me, "Hey, Bob, when will the members get a say in who the IAM endorses for President of the United States?" I said, "Wow, what a novel idea, brother. Let's look into that." Well, we announced this process in 2019 at the legislative conference. We promoted this registration for endorsement through IML, and the IAM Journal, IAM conferences, and other gatherings from coast to coast. And just after Super Tuesday this March, our members who registered to vote and were given the opportunity to vote online for any presidential candidate, regardless of party, our membership's top choice from each party were then voted upon by our state council presidents, who unanimously chose Vice President Biden as the IAM's endorsed candidate to be the next president of the United States. If there's anything the last several months have shown us, it's how important this next election will be to this union and for generations of Americans to come. I truly believe that the soul of our nation is at stake. The very right to form or join a union and collectively bargain is at stake. Brothers and sisters, our future is at stake. But we are looking down the ballot as well to the Congress, governorship, state legislators, city halls, school boards. We need union people and our allies at every level of the government. We need women at every level of the government. We need people of color at every level of the government. And together, we have the power to do it. Together, we have the power to overcome any pandemic or national crisis. Together, we can change the moral fabric of this nation and make this world a place better for everyone. Brothers and sisters, we'll make it through this, and we will be stronger than ever for it. Never forget, we are the fighting machinists for a reason. We have never given up, and we never will. I say to you and your families, may God bless you, and Godspeed to all of you, and may God bless our great union. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Now we're going to hear from our Secretary-Treasurer, Susan Palmer.
All right. Good afternoon, District 751 members and union family. I'm Susan Palmer, and I'm your District Secretary-Treasurer. Before I start, I'd like to thank Bob and Gary for your words of encouragement and for your steady leadership in these difficult times. And in keeping with the theme of the conference, I know you would have been true suffragettes back in the day. So with that, now I have the distinct honor of introducing our next speaker, AFL Secretary-Treasurer Liz Shuler. Liz grew up right next door to us in Oregon, part of the Great Northwest, so I consider her one of us. She also grew up in an IBEW union family. After graduating college in the early 90s, she struggled to find decent work, but then in 1993, all that changed when she finally found the job that would change her life. She was hired by IBEW Local 125 as a union organizer, where she earned her chops. She found her calling, and from what I can tell, never looked back. Like most union representatives do, she went on to wear many hats. She organized, she got politically active, and one day ended up fighting the greedy corporate energy giant Enron to keep them from muscling through electricity deregulation. And she, along with a broad-based coalition, thankfully won that fight. In the end, as some of you are old enough to remember, Enron's reckless corporate behavior resulted in bankruptcy and her own father losing his pension. So she knows, like us, how that feels to have a greedy corporation take your pension. But we fight on, like machinists do. And so did she. After many more achievements on behalf of her local, she eventually went on to hold position in her International Political and Legislative Affairs Department in Washington, D.C., where she still resides to this day with her husband, David, and her black lab named Trader. In 2004, she was then promoted to the prestigious position of assistant to IBEW's international president, serving in that capacity for 5 years, further making an impact on workers' lives that she represented. I don't know Liz personally, but what I do know by reading about her in preparation for this introduction is that the pathway to leadership in the labor movement is typically the same. You get involved, you wear many hats, you work really hard for the membership you represent any way you can, no excuses, and you help further the labor movement any way you can because you care about people and what's right for America. By doing that, other people take notice, and in Liz's case, it rightfully catapulted her into becoming the first woman to be elected Secretary-Treasurer of the AFL-CIO in 2009. And at the same time, she became the second top leader in the entire labor movement. An old labor saying is that a woman's place is in her union, but I say a woman's place is also at the top of her union. And with Liz and April here today, that may just be the case someday. So with that, I'm more than proud to introduce a woman to you that has earned her chops and would most certainly have been a suffragist back in the day. Our sister and native Northwesterner AFL-CIO Secretary-Treasurer Liz Shuler. Liz.
Wow, oh my gosh. Susan, thank you so much. I'm not worthy.
Oh, yeah.
Hello, Powerhouse members of 751. I am thrilled to be with you today on this beautiful Saturday. And I know I would much rather be with you in Seattle than being here in Washington, D.C. I can say that for sure. And as Susan said, I grew up down the road in Portland, so the Northwest is home for me. And my local IBW 125 actually has members in Washington State, so I feel very much at home. Just want to thank my sister Secretary-Treasurer for the introduction. Susan, thank you. That was overly generous. Of course, to John Holden, to Gary, all the officers and members on this call, want to thank you for your leadership. To each of the committees that worked so hard to make today's event possible, and the timing could not be more important. And I'm also so glad that I heard your international president, Bob Martinez, give his remarks. And we are so grateful to have him as a leader at our table, the National AFL-CIO table, because he is a powerful voice for so many things, but I would say the voice on the importance of protecting and growing manufacturing in this country. And he is a driving force, an aggressive voice, setting an agenda as president of our Industrial Union Council. So thank you, Bob. And to be on this call with my shero, April Sims. If you haven't read her piece in The Stand, you should. I did. It was very impactful. And of course, the great Bill Fletcher. Thank you so much. I'm among giants today. So I want to thank you all for having the foresight to host this conference and for being so committed to gender equality, racial justice, and to our labor movement. And the theme today, as we've heard, is winning the vote. How appropriate, given how important this election in November will be. And of course, before any winning can happen, there is always struggle. And the suffragists had to struggle to amend the Constitution to get women the right to vote. And civil rights leaders in the 1960s had to struggle in the fight for basic and equal rights. And even before this year's election kicked off in full force, before COVID-19, before the racial injustices of the past few weeks, we knew it was going to be a struggle. And I think back to the voter suppression just in the last several election cycles. And too many people in power want to make it harder for us to cast a ballot. And they want to make it especially hard for Black and brown voters. And you probably saw this on the news this week, and I know Bob referenced the challenges we've been seeing over and over again, but Georgia had its primary election. And just like the past few elections, it was a mess. And you saw the long lines, people couldn't vote. They had some new voting machines, of course, that weren't working, and poll workers didn't know how to operate them. And many of the locations ran out of provisional ballots, so you couldn't even do that. And not surprisingly, the worst problems happened in predominantly African-American neighborhoods. And at a polling location near Atlanta, I saw in a news article, a retiree named Terry showed up to vote, and she was awesome because she showed up right after the polls opened at 7 a.m. Hours later, she was still waiting in line, but she was steadfast. And she was quoted as saying, "I refuse not to be heard." So she waited it out. And I mean, I admire Terry's resolve, but voting should not require resolve. Voting is a right, and it shouldn't be like this, but it is. And we shouldn't be surprised. Just speaking of Georgia, look what happened to Stacey Abrams 2 years ago. She ran for governor, right? Her opponent was the sitting Secretary of State who controls all the rules around voting. And so what did he use that position to do? He disenfranchised voters of color. He denied and delayed new registrations. He purged the voting rolls. He used all of these tricks, and now he's the governor of the state. And as she ended her campaign, Stacey Abrams said that, she said, "I will not concede because the erosion of our democracy is not right." And voter suppression chips away at our democracy. It's hard enough to convince someone who has never voted before that their vote can make a difference, right? Then you add in these complicated voter ID laws and the registration purges and all these lines waiting hours on election day. Now, I know Washington State, of course, has vote by mail, and I know my home state of Oregon does as well, but these are starting to translate into the vote by mail process, and we're gonna need that as we prepare to vote in this pandemic. And all of these obstacles do exactly what our opponents want. It discourages people from voting, and especially those who already feel marginalized. And that keeps us from winning and making the change that this country needs. We always knew it was going to be difficult. right? A difficult election year. And then came the coronavirus. And we have watched as millions of essential workers have been thrown right into the front lines, often risking their own health because they don't have the protective equipment. Then you have millions of more people who have lost their jobs, in some cases overnight. And I know you all have experienced layoffs. And as I talk to people, I hear and see the anxiety in their voices, and this lack of certainty that's around us exacerbates the stress and the economic pressure because we don't know what the future holds. And this pandemic is hitting some communities harder than others. There's this famous saying, right? We might all be in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. In every aspect of this virus, whether it's illness, death, unemployment, healthcare, housing, for every measurement, Black and brown people are hit hardest. And the impact on women is disproportionate as well. Think about this. Who are the workers most likely to be on the front lines as nurses and grocery clerks? Women. Women of color, especially. And not many people realize this, but women have lost their jobs at much higher rates than men in every single sector. Some are calling it a she-cession, right? So on top of an already difficult election year, we got hit with this global pandemic. And then on May 25th, the world saw police officers kill George Floyd. And the pain, frustration, and outrage at his death, right after the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and so many others, has been almost too much to bear. And all of these challenges, from voter suppression to health disparities to unsafe working conditions to police violence, are complex. But this complexity is not new to you. And we are in a seminal moment, a fundamental struggle for justice across the board. And the recent videos of police brutality and the challenges of COVID-19 have only shined a new spotlight on what's already we knew was broken, right, in our country. It's been broken for a long time. And I'm sure you hear, like I do, people saying, I just wish things could get back to normal. But normal is not good enough. Normal, quote, normal is no paid sick leave, no childcare. Normal is a country where immigrants are driven to live in the shadows. Normal is an America where you can still be fired in half of all states for being LGBTQ. Normal is violence against Black people who are simply trying to lead their lives. We do not want to get back to normal. We need to get back to better. And think about this opportunity we have, folks. We can rebuild our country so working people can prosper and earn living wages and get the health care they need and have a secure retirement. We can rewrite the rules of the economy that have been rigged against working people for way too long. And we can create a new and better normal where all people get the respect and the dignity they deserve. Now, this fundamental fundamental fight for justice is why we're here, right? This is why we are in this movement, and this is why you are here on this Zoom call on a Saturday. And we can take on these challenges, as difficult as they may seem. We can take them on and we can win for workers. And how do we do it? Well, we do it like we always have, by coming together in solidarity with one another in our unions, but also with our communities. And as the coronavirus hit, the labor movement united. I saw it, you saw it, all across the country. We pushed for employers to provide PPE and hazard pay and workplace safety. I saw union members starting food drives to help people in need, taking up collections and gathering up masks to donate to local hospitals. We fought for relief for workers, as Bob said, in the CARES Act legislation in Congress. The breadth and scope of what we've stepped up to do has been nothing short of incredible. And just over the past few weeks, the labor movement has also mobilized and spoken loudly that Black Lives Matter. And I have been so proud to see union members be a part of the protests across this country. And within our federation, we have actually started taking this moment to look inward and have the uncomfortable conversations and start to do the hard work to make change within our unions and advance the fight for justice. And protesting helps people wake up to our struggles, but protesting alone is not going to bring about system-wide changes in our country. That is what voting is for, and that is why we're here today. The suffragists, as was mentioned, like Susan B. Anthony, knew this. Back in 1897, way back in 1897, Susan B. Anthony said, "There will never be complete equality until women themselves help to make laws and elect lawmakers." Sadly, here we are in 2020, right? We're still struggling to make that happen, to get more women into public office. We need more women making laws at all levels of government. And do you know that in Congress, that's the House of Representatives and the Senate combined, women only make up 24% of that body? We are over 50% of the population, and we only have a 24% voice in Congress. Now, there's a lot of focus on women's role in this upcoming election, and a lot of key voting blocks out there that are being talked about, but many believe women will be the key to whether we elect lawmakers who support working people's values. And to me, that is the best way to commemorate the 100th anniversary of winning the vote. And that is why motivating and mobilizing women voters is a priority for me, for so many, and I would say across our movement, and especially at the AFL-CIO in this election cycle. And we also can't forget, of course, that we will still probably be in the midst of a pandemic this November. So this election is going to look and feel different than any other in our lifetimes. And now is the time to prepare, and that's what we're doing. We don't think we're going to be able to go door to door to get people to the polls or get people mobilized or get those absentee ballots or vote by mail ballots filled out. So our federation is planning new ways to use the labor movement's strength and organizing tools to turn out voters and make sure that, you know, everyone's right is protected. And specifically to combat voter suppression, we have started working with allies and partners like Stacey Abrams' organization called Fair Fight. Hope you've heard of it. If you haven't, look it up online. Even LeBron James just announced a big donation to Fair Fight. And the goal there is to build voter protection teams with Democratic state parties and local allies across the country to make sure every vote counts. And we will be there. We'll be providing poll workers and local infrastructure. So to wrap up, I just never like to leave a crowd without a call to action. And I said at the beginning, we have big challenges ahead of us. And to bring that change that we all desperately want in November, that everyone's talked about here today, we need every single one of you activated and ready to go. And we need your help to register new voters. And even today, as you leave this conference, you can be thinking in your head about how you can reach out beyond your immediate circle and commit to maybe even talking to even just one new young person in your midst, someone who might not know why voting matters, and to make sure they registered to vote. And I know all eyes are on the presidential election, but we've got races up and down the ballot that at the state and local level that will be critical, right? So after registering all those new voters, think about how you can help a state or local candidate who is pro-worker. And I just wanted to rattle off a few names of some great candidates in your region who come from the labor movement, folks who have stepped up in our labor movement to run for office. And there's a Washington State Nurses Association member, Ingrid Anderson, running for state senate in the 5th legislative district. You have Suzanne Woodard, UFCW member, running in the 10th legislative district in the state house. IBEW 76 member Clint Bryson, running for state house in the 19th legislative district. and Carrie Hesh from the Teamsters running for State House in the 26th District. Those are just a few. I'm sure April and others can lend more to this, but I wanted to just remind folks that when you go to vote, you're also voting for your own who are running for office. So let's help them win. And it's up to all of us to bring the full weight and power of the labor movement to this moment. And it's up to all of us to elect people who are going to make the system-wide changes we so urgently need. And it's up to all of us to stand strong together in the struggle for justice. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz. We really appreciate you coming today and speaking. We are set to take a 10-minute or 15-minute break to give everyone a break, and we'll come back on. It's 12:58, so be ready to come back right around 1:12 or so. Okay, thank you.
No prima ballerina making half cause you Latina. 1 in 4 women homeless cause someone beat her. Respect that we deserve is the power that we earn. Hashtag me too, my body, my turn.
We need reunification, cause we treat the genders like 2 different nations, and we don't have time to be having no patience. Remember last time that we waited for changes. I like a woman that stands for what's right. I like a woman that stands for right. Still go to work since it's off with that bad. Cause she only make half what the men make at night.
We're taking back the power, cause we deserve it. A women's rights, a human right. We want an equal voice, equal pay, equal rights. Taking back the power, cause we deserve it. A women's rights, a human rights. We want an equal voice, equal pay, equal rights.
When we stand in allegiance, we will never be defeated. She is so powerful but mistreated. I've seen what society thinks she should be, but every single woman is unique. You are different, you are gifted, stronger than you know, they can never take your soul. Broken, beaten, torn to pieces, stronger than you know, they can never take your soul.
We've been chastised and laughed at, but women always bounce back. Limit my abilities, I'm swerving way past that. Hold up, they ain't grasp that, we can never backtrack. Women run the world and that's a fact, snap or cap that. Wanna make a change, oh that's funny, me too. They objectifying women and they thinking it's cool. Wanna talk about equality, I'm joining in too. I'm Dakota, I guess you could call me Mrs. Me Too. We're taking back the power, cause we deserve it. A women's rights, a human right. We want an equal voice, equal pay, equal rights. Taking back the power, cause we deserve it. A women's rights, a human rights. We want
want an equal voice, equal pay, equal right. Powerful beyond belief, I breathe soul into life. Not despite of, because I am women. I am the revolution, ancestral calling, sojourner's truth. Susan B. Anthony and Ida B. Wells paved the way so that Ava DuVernay could create today. Blinded by divinity, our powers go on to infinity. United pillars of liberty. Taking back the power, cause we deserve it. A women's rights, a human right. We want an equal voice, equal pay, equal rights.
Tombstone. If you're living underneath the bridge, man, all roads lead to home. I got a hidden flask, I'm paid in cash, got a cross above my bed. You know, I hitchhiked from Chicago, and a man walked up and said, this is a union town, all down the line. This is a union town, all down the line. And if you come to strip our rights away, we'll give you hell every time. This is a union town, all down the line. Today the policeman's a union man, from the firefighters, my friend. And the kids locked in the Capitol are fighting till the end. And we're not gonna break tonight, and we're not gonna bend. Some say the union's down, but I asked around, and everybody said, this is a union town, all down the line. This is a union town, all down the line. And if they come to strip our rights away, we'll give them hell every time. This is a union town, all down the line. A reaction, equal and opposite. That's why, my friend, the blood tastes good every time I'm here. I got a will to win and a Cheshire grin. Yeah, the night watchman is near, and you can't get it where you're at, but you can sure get it here. So come rain or sleet or dark night, come wind or frigid snow, there's 100,000 in the streets, and that number's gonna grow. And when we put the governor on trial, I'll be in the front row. Just take a look around, we're a union town. 1, 2, 3, 4, let's go. This is a union town, all down the line. This is a union town, all down the line. And if they come to strip our rights away, we'll give them hell every time. This is a union town, all down the line. All
John, what's your preference? Do you want one more song or do you want to get rolling?
I guess, how long is this one?
2 minutes, 32 seconds.
Why don't we do it and then we'll start.
Okay.
That I want to say something that touched my heart, and it began this way. I was born by the river in a little tent, and just like the river.
Sarà un pieno, vedi mia ma guarda quelli che Martinez è meraviglioso.
We are tired of war. We are tired running. We are tired of our children being raped. Kindly convey this to the President of Nigeria. Thank you.
Oh yeah. And when I saw them the withdraw it, never. I was right back down, and on my bended knee. Yes, I was. Oh, but I know, a change is gonna come.
Speak truth to power. Tell him what it is you want, and then let history be the judge of all of you.
I got the eye of the tiger, dancing through the fire. I am the champion, and you're gonna hear me roar louder than a lion. I am the champion, and you're gonna hear me
Okay, everyone, I appreciate you hanging in there on the break, and we're going to go ahead and get started again. Just one thing before we do that. One of the things that we were planning when this was going to be an in-person conference was a reenactment of a lot of the work and efforts that went into the suffragist movement, and we had some actors that were going to portray this. So we weren't able to do that here because of COVID and on Zoom call, but we did send out a video that I would like just to reference back to, that if you haven't watched it yet, I hope you'll watch it later, because it documents and shows a lot of great information around the movement. So, all right, with that, I want to introduce our Chief of Staff, Richard Jackson. Go ahead, Richard.
All right, thank you, John, and thank you all of our participants and panelists. Thank you, Bob and Gary. Wonderful speeches. Appreciate everything you guys do for us. Today, I'm excited that I have the pleasure of introducing April Sims. I first met April at the Cascade Regional Labor Leader Initiative class, where roughly 20 other labor leaders spent 3 one-week sessions together. After that, April was gracious enough to host a race and labor Train the Trainer class at our Union Hall here in Seattle. Then earlier this year, April Sims agreed to be the keynote speaker at the yearly Seafarers Luncheon that District 751 hosts every year. With each opportunity to be around April, I've learned a little more about her, and I've taken away some very important lessons from each of these opportunities. One, that we need people like April in leadership now more than ever. I've learned that she is a strong woman who has overcome struggle. And there's nothing more inspiring than a woman who has overcome struggle in life and in the workplace. April has overcome both, and in December 2018, she was elected as Secretary-Treasurer of the Washington State Labor Council, AFL-CIO, by its affiliated unions. April is the first woman of color and the first Black woman to be elected as a Washington State Labor Council executive officer. That makes me proud, and I'm proud to introduce April Sims. April?
Thank you, Richard. You almost made me emotional, and that's not really fair. So I appreciate that warm introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real honor to be with you all today. I want to thank President John Holden and Secretary-Treasurer Sue Palmer and the leadership of 751 for inviting me. And again, thank you, Richard, for your warm introduction. I'm really grateful that you didn't read my whole bio because that thing is dry, so I appreciate that. I do want to take a moment and just acknowledge that no matter where you are, we're all on Indigenous land. That this is the land, the traditional land of our tribal sisters, brothers, and siblings. So I want to take a moment to honor with respect and gratitude our tribal elders, both past and present, for their stewardship of this land and its people, and thank them for allowing me to do my work on their land. I would also like to invite everyone to take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us all here today. I'm April Sims. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm excited to join you for this celebration and this conversation around winning the vote, and more importantly, what it means to us as a movement to ensure everyone can exercise this right. And right now, as we gather to celebrate the centennial of women winning the right to vote, I have to take a moment to just acknowledge what's happening in the world around us. That right now, there are hundreds of thousands of folks protesting in the streets across the nation and around the world. And it's clear that something exciting is happening now. We're witnessing a moment of raised consciousness as the racism and violence that rots the institution of policing, and indeed all of our institutions, is exposed to the light. There is a countrywide mass movement demanding justice. Justice for George Floyd, justice for Breonna Taylor, justice for Manuel Ellis, and justice for all the other names we know and the many more names we may never know. But beyond justice for lives taken, there's an overwhelming call to acknowledge and dismantle the racism and inequities that are baked into our institutions, into our policing, into our government and elections, into our education system, and yes, even into our own unions. This public reckoning with the system of racism is a call for all of us to critically examine how white supremacy shows up throughout our society and throughout our histories. So today, when we talk about the centennial of women winning the right to vote, we must acknowledge that by and large, many Black Americans could not vote until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which is a full 45 years after the 19th Amendment granted white women the right to vote. And that change only happened because people took to the streets. They marched and protested and stood their ground, much in the same way they're doing today. So it's altogether right and appropriate that we should be meeting today, celebrating the centennial, and committing ourselves to the next phase of our work. To truly recognize this centennial, we have to have a candid conversation about how the system has prevented many of us from accessing the rights guaranteed us all under the law. Universal suffrage, or the right to vote, is one of the many rights guaranteed on paper that we are still working to realize today. And we're blessed to be joined with by Brother Bill Fletcher, so I'll leave much of the in-depth discussion around voter suppression to the true expert among us. And today I'd like to focus on how attacks on the right to vote are fundamentally connected to our ongoing work towards becoming an anti-racist labor movement and to building power for the working class. Now, history tells us there's nearly 100 years between the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which gave all men the right to vote in 1870, and the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Which prohibited racial discrimination in voting. And that's nearly 100 years of systematic effort to deny many Black, Brown, and Native Americans their right to vote. We're talking poll taxes, literacy tests, and state-backed violent intimidation that effectively denied Black Americans suffrage, while simultaneously denying access to land, economic opportunity, and legal remedies when harmed. And this is the world my grandparents were born into. My grandparents were sharecroppers in rural Louisiana, which means they, like all of the generations before them, picked cotton just to survive. And when my grandfather learned that the landowner was shorting some of the families on the crop payout, he got some of the other farmers all riled up. You know, I like to think of him as a union organizer. But as you can imagine, the landowner didn't like that much. So he sent a group of men to the house, and they drug my grandfather out to the whipping post, intent on making an example out of him. Now, he escaped narrowly by pulling what my aunt would always refer to as his Texas Jack, which was this knife he kept tucked inside his right boot. But he knew if they found him, they'd lynch him for sure. So he and my grandmother and the 5 children all went into hiding, and they made their way to northern Louisiana, where my grandmother's family lived. And there, her family told him he could stay, but only if he could learn to keep his head down and his mouth shut, because they didn't want that kind of trouble around there. And my grandfather knew he couldn't raise his family with any dignity in the violent and segregated South. And he dreamt of a better life, not just for him, but for his children and his children's children. So he left my grandmother in the safekeeping of her family, and he migrated to Washington in search of social and economic justice. And here, for the first time in his life, he earned a fair day's pay for a hard day's work. He was able to save enough money to send for my grandmother and the family, and he was able to exercise his right to vote. It wasn't until my grandparents arrived in Washington state in the mid-40s that they could freely exercise their constitutional right to vote. And for them, voting was more than a duty, it was an event. Now, my 86-year-old aunt is the family historian, and she still tells stories of Election Day. She describes it like a holiday. They would dress in their Sunday's best, they would gather all the neighbors, and they would vote as a community. And then they'd come back and have a neighborhood feast. And being able to vote was so important to my grandparents and my family that my 86-year-old aunt still volunteers to help get out the vote. Now, she's waiting for Biden to announce his VP pick before she really turns out folks to vote, but she's very excited and very engaged. And while my grandparents were able to vote because they migrated to the North, back down South, voting was still out of reach for many Black Americans. In fact, fighting for the right to vote was a central focus of the civil rights movement. Civil rights organizers kept pushing because they knew there could be no true liberation without the right to vote. But organizers in the streets needed allies in the halls of power. And by 1955, with the unification of the AFL and the CIO, organized labor started dedicating resources to fighting racial discrimination. In fact, the AFL-CIO worked to abolish poll taxes all across the country. The labor movement played a key role in the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, using its communication network to build support for the act among rank and file members, and using its political influence to build the pressure needed to get the act passed. Labor leaders directed local and state affiliates and pressured employer associations to adhere to the voting rights and fair employment provisions in that act. And the AFL-CIO affiliates ran voter registration drives and created bail funds for organizers in the South. But the Civil Rights Act didn't do enough to ensure the vote for Black Americans. Now, history tells us in 1965, civil rights leaders held a series of marches in Selma, Alabama, where the local sheriff was notorious for his violent intimidation of Black workers. The events of one of these marches, known as Bloody Sunday, are now notorious. Images of police brutally beating nonviolent protesters raised the consciousness of Americans then, much in the same way it's being raised now. And days later, the Voting Rights Act was passed in Congress, with the protesters in the streets and the allies in the AFL working in the halls of power, building the pressure needed to get it passed. And the impact of the Voting Rights Act was significant. Between 1964 and 1969, Black voter registration in Southern states skyrocketed. I mean, consider in 1964, before the Voting Rights Act, in Mississippi, only 6.7% of Black folks were registered to vote. And by 1969, 66.5% of Black Americans in Mississippi were registered to vote. So the achievements of the 19th Amendment that were made real by the Voting Rights Act should absolutely be celebrated. But decades after its passage, continued injustice deprives too many of our fellow Americans the right to vote to this day. Now, overt voter suppression continues across this country, and I said I wouldn't get into it because that's Bill Fletcher's thing, but I do want to lift up a couple of things, like the voter ID laws that have been revived in places like North Carolina, where they actually researched the form of ID Black folks were the least likely to have, and then made that the requirement to be able to vote. I mean, this scheme was so overtly racist that a federal court struck it down on the grounds that it surgically targeted Black and brown voters. Or in Alabama, where a new law requiring a driver's license to vote was coupled with the closures of dozens of DMVs in counties with the highest concentration of people of color. Nationally, we're seeing a vast reduction in polling places, which is increasing the average distance voters must travel and the time they must wait in line just in order to vote. And all of this is happening in the midst of a global pandemic where social distancing is our primary tool to protect our communities. And we witnessed it just this week as voters waited in line for hours to vote in select cities in Georgia. But let's not kid ourselves. This suppression isn't confined to the South. Wisconsin's primary election was marked by massive lines, which was the direct result of mass closures in polling places in Milwaukee and Madison. And we could spend all day talking about gerrymandering in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Arizona, and Texas, and how that's attempted to stifle the voices of people of color nationwide. Now, these overt attempts to suppress the vote are coupled with the undercurrent of white supremacy that flows through our institutions. And in Washington, where our vote by mail system removes many of the barriers to voting, systemic inequities still result in disenfranchisement. I mean, if you look at our criminal justice system, at least 38 states deny anyone in state custody or under any form of state supervision the right to vote, including Washington state. But several states go further, requiring folks with felony records to jump through a series of hoops to win back their constitutional rights. And in Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio, anyone with a felony conviction is permanently disenfranchised. When you consider that 1 in 3 Black men, 1 in 6 Latino men are likely to face incarceration at some point in their lives, and likewise, Black women are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white women. And the disparity is not because Black and brown people are more likely to commit crimes. I mean, people of all races commit crime at roughly the same rate, but Black and brown communities are over-policed and underprotected, meaning that Black and brown folks are more likely to be arrested, more likely to be convicted, and more likely to be given harsh sentences. So we can see how our struggles against voter suppression, against racist law enforcement in our communities, against white supremacy, and against capitalism are all connected. And we must keep in mind that the diversity of the labor movement is growing. So by 2036, the working class, which is all of us, will be majority minority. And working people aged 25 to 34 will hit that benchmark next year. And in 2025, our unions will be majority women. That's in 4 short years. So the work we do now to ensure racial and gender justice in our movement is critical to ensuring solidarity and building power for the working class. Celebrating this centennial means fighting voter suppression. If we want to ensure that the voices of all working people are heard, we must join our sisters, brothers, and siblings in the fight for racial and gender justice and look for ways to leverage the power of labor. Now, this election year, we're faced with an unprecedented set of circumstances, a global pandemic that's threatening our communities, a pending recession and increased economic hardship, and a mass resurgence of the centuries-old struggle for racial justice. This moment requires leadership, It won't be quick or easy. But we are not without guidance. We can look to our ancestors and our elders in the movement. We know that labor is at its strongest when working people stand shoulder to shoulder across race, across creed, across gender, and across borders. Working people united from the streets to our workplaces, in our homes and in the halls of power, have the tools at our disposal to force change. Now, protest is one of these tools, as we've seen in recent weeks, but voting is also a tool. And the importance and the power of exercising our right to vote has never been greater. There's a reason that powerful elites in this country have fought to deny access to the vote to as many people as possible throughout our history, because collectively, working people hold tremendous power at the ballot box. And boy, do we have some opportunities to exercise that power in 2020. We have an opportunity to elect champions for the working class up and down the ballot, from the White House to the State House and every office in between. But sisters, brothers, siblings, it's not enough that we vote. We have to make sure that our friends and our family and our colleagues are not only registered to vote and not only turn out to vote in the primary in August and the general in November, but that they vote their entire ballot. So we'll be running our Labor Neighbor program this year. Now it may look a little different, but what remains the same is that we'll be counting on union members to talk to other union members to exercise that power. And we can only do it with leaders like all of you. And make no mistake, if you're joining us on a Saturday afternoon, you are all leaders in this movement. And I know many of us are feeling angry and frustrated and grief-stricken and maybe anxious in this moment. And it can be overwhelming. And for some of us, it can make us feel isolated and powerless. But what if instead we try to think of those emotions as bricks and as the material to use to build a movement that demands the future working people need? Let us use the tools available to us to join our rage, sadness, and anxiety with that of our siblings in this movement and create a force that cannot be ignored, speaking with one voice that cannot be silenced. That is our charge, and it's a pleasure to do this work with all of you. Thank you for inviting me to speak at the conference.
Thank you, April. We really appreciate your story and your words. Thank you very much. Now I have the honor and opportunity to introduce our next speaker, who's going to take us into a lot of discussion around all these topics. Bill Fletcher Jr. He has been an activist since his teen years. He graduated from college and he went to work as a welder in a shipyard. That's where he entered the labor movement. Over the years, he has been active in workplace and community struggles, as well as electoral campaigns. He is an author and has received accolades for his work. He has worked for several labor unions in addition to serving as a senior staff person in the AFL-CIO. I have been fortunate to be able to work with Bill through the Washington State Labor Council and their work on race and labor. I have appreciated Bill's willingness to work with me. I've counted on him and asked for advice when I had questions and when I needed help working through tough subjects in the labor movement regarding race and barriers to organizing new members. He's helped me and inspired me in all of our discussions, and I owe him the thanks that he's taken the time to spend with me. We wanted to have a membership conference here at 751 with our human rights, women's, and labor history committees for a couple years now. So it's a great opportunity for our members to grow, be empowered, and make a difference in the labor movement. Bill was the first person I thought of that I wanted our members to hear from. So I'm grateful that Bill was not just available to speak at our conference, but he helped us craft the presentation for today to ensure that we would be successful. So please join me in welcoming Bill Fletcher Jr. to address our conference today. Thank you. Go ahead, Bill.
Thank you, President Holden. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And I too wish that I was in Seattle rather than sitting here in Maryland, but that too shall come. We're here to celebrate one historic victory, but to simultaneously sound the alarm about a danger at our gates. So we're here to celebrate the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage but we're also looking at that not in an abstraction, but in a continuum, in a struggle that this country has undergone, not about voting, but about the question of democracy. And that's actually where I want to start. Because what's interesting is that in the United States, truth be told, we oppose history, but we embrace myth. If there's something that happened historically that makes somebody uncomfortable, we shove it under the rug and pretend that it didn't exist. And instead, we surface things that make us feel better. I'll give you a few examples. So when we think about the American Revolution, all too often we think about, well, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and all that other stuff. What almost no one talks about is the Proclamation of 1763, which in many respects was the chief motivating force behind the American Revolution. What was the Proclamation of 1763? It was that the British Crown signed a deal with Native American tribes that the colonists would not go further west than the Appalachians. The colonists said, no, we want to grab the Indian land. The British are oppressing us from taking the land from the Indians. Well, see, if you look at history that way, it makes the American Revolution look a little bit more complicated than just the speeches by Patrick Henry or Sam Adams or anyone else. That history is so important because if you don't understand it, you end up embracing myth and you end up going down some really weird paths. When you look at the development of the United States in the so-called founding fathers, truth be told, they were actually ambivalent about democracy. They weren't really sure it was such a great idea. And I'm not talking about just those that wanted George Washington to be a king, or those that even wanted George Washington to continue being president after his second term. I mean that there was a serious debate in the construction of this country about things like voting. For example, what lay under all of this was this deep fear that the founding fathers had about two problems. One was something that they referenced as the mob. And I don't mean the Cosa Nostra. I don't mean the Russian mob. I mean, when they talked about the mob, what they meant was masses of people, poor people, who didn't like the way things were. That people like Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, and others were fearing would ultimately rise up. So one of the things that they thought about in constructing our government was how to keep the mob in check. Other thing that they were concerned about was slaves. They wanted to make sure, they had this real problem. There was all these slaves in the South. How do you construct a political system that excludes the slaves, but also, given that the Southern white population was smaller than the Southern Northern population, how do you make sure that the Southern white population has greater say in the overall system? Well, you create the Electoral College. So as opposed to almost every other country on this planet, where you have one person, one vote, in the United States, we don't have that right at the national level. There's this intermediary body called the Electoral College, which obscures the vote. Let me give a concrete, very recent example. Because of the Electoral College, huge portions of our electorate end up being excluded. One of the things I stumbled across a while ago was that in the 2012 election, the Democratic Party put almost no resources into South Carolina. Why? Because South Carolina was treated as a foregone conclusion. It was going to vote a Republican. 40% of the vote in South Carolina went to Obama with no resources. Now think for a second, if we had some sort of proportional system. First of all, if we had one person, one vote, or if we had a proportional system, so that in South Carolina, 40% of the vote would have gone to Obama. What that would mean is that there would be no such thing as safe states anymore. Every state would be open, which is exactly what democracy is supposed to be. But the founding fathers were really worried about that. They didn't really want every situation to be up for grabs, because that might mean the mob, meaning working people and poor people, might get out of control. So you have from the very beginning these restrictions in terms of what it meant to have a democracy. But added to that, in 1790, only 60 to 70% of white men could vote. Now, what that meant is that despite, well, I'll get to that in a second, 60 to 70% of white men could vote. That meant if you were a white woman, you couldn't vote. Obviously, if you were a slave, you couldn't vote. If you're an Indian, you couldn't vote, right? So that meant you had minority rule, numerically, okay? And what was also interesting is that this is at the same time when the United States is debating who can become a citizen. So in the 1790s, they basically said citizens were open to free whites. It didn't say free white men. Now this raises a really fascinating question, because if citizenship was open to white men, why weren't white women voting? Well, they got blocked. And in fact, as I'll get to later, when the suffragette movement starts rising and raising this question, they asked that. Wait a minute, if we're citizens, why can't we vote? And they kept getting dismissed, pushed aside. It even went to the Supreme Court. And check this out. This is what the Supreme Court said in its wisdom. In 1875? Yeah, 1875. They said, you're too late. You're too late. Can you imagine that? They said to the women, you're too late. You should have raised this a while ago. It's too late to raise this, and now you have to have an amendment. I mean, talk about democracy. So what happened is from the beginning of the country, there's been a fight over who can vote and the expansion of the franchise. In the beginning, vote was tied to being a white man and owning property. But by the early to mid 1800s, that starts to expand so that the property requirement is removed. But at the same time that the property requirement is removed, free Africans living in the United States, free black folks, were systematically denied the right to vote. It's just sort of bizarre. So you remove the property requirement, but you have, particularly in the North, free African Americans, and they then end up being completely disenfranchised. And this takes us up to the Civil War. Now, after the Civil War, there is a demand for the expansion of the franchise. And in the fight that was going on, there was a unity between many white suffragettes and people that were supporting the franchise for African Americans. It results in the passage of the 15th Amendment. The problem is that there were white suffragettes that, like Susan B. Anthony, that took the position that unless women were included, they weren't going to support the 15th Amendment. And this drove a wedge in that struggle. The reality was that in 1868, there was not going to be the extension of the franchise to women. That was the reality of the political situation there. But we were in the middle of what was called the Reconstruction. There was an attempt to reconstruct the South and technically make it a more democratic place. Without the 15th Amendment, that would have meant that there was absolutely no black vote in the South. And even though the Reconstruction was ultimately defeated by racists and property owners, for a period of roughly about 15 years, there were dramatic experiments in changing the country around, including the introduction of public education and a number of other things. When Reconstruction is defeated in 1877, there was an effort that went to systematically disenfranchising black voters. And it was driven by the rich in the South. Now, here's where it also gets interesting. The rich in the South weren't simply interested in disenfranchising black folks. They wanted to disenfranchise the poor, because one of the things that was going on in Reconstruction, which scared the bejeebies out of the rich, the plantation owners, was that the poor black and the poor white were often working together, joining together to fight for change in the South. And so the rich, using the race card, basically were able to push through all kinds of different franchisements from basically 1877 to the early 1900s to restrict the right to vote. But by restricting the right of blacks, they didn't just simply say black folks couldn't vote. They started introducing other things. Like, for example, the grandfather clause, which basically said, if your grandfather could vote before the passage of the 15th Amendment, you could vote. Well, that clearly meant that those of us of African descent weren't going to be doing any voting anytime soon. There were poll taxes that were not restricted to African Americans. There were literacy tests that were not restricted to African Americans. There were English-only ballots, which becomes very important in the Southwest. And there was the introduction of the white primary, where it was ultimately said that only whites could participate in those primaries. And despite the fact that there were initial civil rights legislation, there was no oversight by the federal government after 1877. Now, compounding this problem of the defeat of Reconstruction was that the suffragette movement split. And what happened was it's basically split three ways. But the most important split was those that basically focused exclusively on winning the right of women to vote. And then there were those that argued to try to win the right of women to vote by convincing white men that white women would vote in favor of white supremacy. And so what you started to see in the late 1800s and early 1900s were efforts by racists in the suffragette movement to articulate that white men had nothing to fear from white women voting because they would join hands in enforcing white supremacy. This became a very, very hot button issue. And as I mentioned, after 1875, when the Supreme Court said to women, you were too late, you should have asked for the right to vote in the 1700s, then all efforts were moved towards an amendment which ultimately passed in 1920. After 1920, there were continued efforts to expand the franchise throughout the entire United States. During World War II, there was a new opening, and someone needs to tell me, by the way, if I'm speaking too long. There was a new opening that was created because in World War II, we had this unusual situation where the United States was at war with countries that were more racist than the United States. Nazi Germany, Japan, and Italy in particular. And so the demand to fight fascism found itself in contradiction with the existence of fascist-like conditions in the South and the Southwest. Well, this presented, what do they call it, cognitive dissonance or something? There was like a real contradiction. In 1944, the Supreme Court ruled in Smith versus Allwright that white primaries were banned. This was a very, very important move. In that same year, this is sort of a tangent, but it's very important for union people to know, was the Supreme Court decision in Steele versus Louisville Railroad. And any of you that ever have been engaged in duty of fair representation cases, if you look at court decisions and look to the very first decision made by a court, it's Steele versus Louisville Railroad, which was a case where the railroad brotherhoods, the railroad unions, were attempting to carry out a final solution of removing African-American workers from the railroads. And the Supreme Court said that a union simply can't do that. Even if it isn't admitting blacks, it had a duty to fairly and equitably represent all workers regardless within their bargaining unit. That's what set the stage for duty fair representation. So this is the same year. And it showed you that the impact of World War II in basically expanding people's idea about what democracy was very important. Following that, you start to see the rise of the contemporary civil rights movement that was not simply about African Americans, but it was also affecting other peoples of color, most particularly Mexican Americans and Chicanos. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment on Equal Protection, the Equal Protection Clause, did not apply only to whites and blacks, which was very important in terms of Latinos. So you're understanding there, the Supreme Court is saying, no, this is not a binary. We're dealing with a broader situation. And so the civil rights movement is pushing forward, along with allies, in expanding the franchise. And that ultimately results in the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And organized labor played a very important role in the passage of both of those acts. But I want to say that there's a qualification here, which is that organized labor historically in the United States was very ambivalent about how it should relate to voting rights. So if you look at organized labor in Europe, for instance, which is something I stumbled across the other day, you find that the union movement was often at the forefront of fighting for political reforms, expanding who was voting. In the United States, that wasn't the case. The union movement, not individual unions, but the union movement as a whole, was frequently behind the curve until the early 60s, when through the pressure of the civil rights movement and the pressure of great leaders like Philip Randolph, the movement really took a turn. In the interest of time, let me just offer a few overall observations. One, why has the struggle for the franchise been so difficult? Well, I answer that by this. Frequently people will say, Bill, is voting important? I say, you're damn right it's important. Say, how do you know? I said, because rich people vote. And if rich people didn't vote, then we could say, well, maybe it was irrelevant. But if rich people are voting, even though they've got all this power, you know that it is of some significance. And it's of some significance because it's about, at the end of the day, a mandate for change in one direction or another. And that's one of the things that's so important for us to think about. That the rich and the powerful, in order to control our society, cannot do it on guns alone. They have to do it by convincing us that we too have a right to make a decision. Well, if you open up that franchise, then ultimately we are making certain decisions. And we can sometimes, when we do it strategically, hold in check the rich and the infamous. And time has shown at different points during the New Deal and others, when we've been able to put in check some of our strongest opponents. But in this fight, race becomes central, because one of the things that our opponents have frequently done is use the race card to try to convince poor and working class whites that they have a greater interest with people like the Koch brothers than they do with their sisters and brothers who are darker than them. And as I said, in the 1800s, what was remarkable was that the rich and the infamous, the plantationocracy, who had been the leaders of the Confederacy that held in contempt the white poor, were able to say to the white poor, you side with us against the black, against the Chicano, against the Native American, against the Asian, and you too will have a chance to dress like us. They played it. They played it like the strings on a violin. Now, April mentioned about voter suppression. So one of the things I would say, almost by way of conclusion, is that we've been dealing with voter suppression since the get-go, right? From the very foundation of this country, the rich and the infamous have been trying to suppress the vote of the poor, of the working person, of those of color. This is not new. The techniques have changed. So after 2008, when this remarkable thing happened, a black man was elected president. See, that's not supposed to happen in a republic that was defined by many people as a white republic. The right wing in the Republican Party decided to move something by focusing on creating an imaginary enemy. I don't know how many people ever saw that great film, The Usual Suspects, with Kevin Spacey. But there's a scene in there where he says, the greatest miracle the devil ever carried out was convincing the world that he didn't exist. And what the right wing among the Republicans have done is a miracle. They have convinced millions of people that there's this danger called voter fraud when there is absolutely no foundation for this. The likelihood of voter fraud, and this has been studied. I was in exchange with someone earlier who was raising some things that, with all due respect, were off the wall. And I was saying that, if you want to rely on comic books as your source of information, that's fine. But if you want to rely on facts, the facts demonstrate time and again that the issue of voter fraud is imaginary. But it's been hyped again and again. And why has it been hyped, and why successfully? And it's been successfully hyped because it's been tied in with a right-wing narrative that's been articulated by extremists. That's called the white genocide narrative and the white replacement narrative. If you remember in Charlottesville, when those fascists were marching, there was a chant that they were given. And if you listened loud enough, you could hear it. They said, Jews will not replace us. Jews will not replace, well, wait a minute. Replace who? And where? And like, what are you talking about? I mean, given the percentage of Jews in this country, replace you. But this is part of this larger narrative that basically says that the common white man is threatened by this influx of barbarians from the global south, whether they're from Latin America, Africa, or indigenous barbarians, right? That are coming to take over and grab your women and do everything else, and that this is the white genocide. And in this moment, what ends up happening is that these right-wingers make the argument, hey, white folks, wink, wink, these people of color are carrying out this voter fraud. No substantiation. But if you have embraced this myth of white replacement, it's really easy to get into it. And then if you start watching too much Fox News or some of these bizarre things on the internet, then you can become convinced, because there's always going to be some lunatic on the internet that's going to do one of these things of, I know someone who knew someone that saw this, this illegal person from southern Chile come in and vote, right? And that proves that there's voter fraud. No substantiation. So this has been one of the things when Trump was talking about millions of illegals voted. Millions of illegals, where, Donald? I mean, like, are you saying that everyone was that stupid at the polls that they couldn't see millions of illegals, undocumented people voting? I mean, really? But it's a convincing argument if you really want to believe that white people are under threat. So my final point is this, and it relates to one of the things that came up in the chat. Voting is only one step. And while I'm of a generation that says that remembering the fight that African Americans and Chicanos and our allies had to win the right to vote, I am voting in every election. I have voted in every election since I turned 18 in 1972. And I'm going to vote until I die. And even if I lose my mind, I'll figure out a way to vote, right? I'm going to vote. But that's not enough. It's not enough. You have to vote strategically. That is, we in the labor movement really need to be thinking about, how do we gain power for working people? It's not just about voting. It's about creating organization. It's about having a working people's agenda that we're fighting for, that we convince our members, yeah, this is important to vote, not just because you despise this particular individual, but because we can do better, that we can bring us closer to civilization and away from lunacy. And so it's really important that your union and others thinking about strategic voting, about building organization, about this is not just a moral question, This is an existential question. This is a question about whether we move further down the path towards authoritarianism and lunacy, or whether we make a break and we can return towards civilization. The choice is ours. It's not up to Donald. It's up to you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. We really appreciate you coming and sharing yourself with us. And we're going to open it up now to questions and answers. I know there's a lot of chatter going on in the chat. You know, what we take pride in our union is we all have the ability to have our say, and we all remember that we must respect each other. We must treat each other as brothers and sisters in this labor movement. And in the spirit of that, I'd like to open up discussion and Q&A. So I believe Spencer and Connie are going to help us do that. Take it away.
So here's how we do that, folks. For those of you who haven't participated in this before, you can ask a question in the Q&A box below at the bottom of your screen. You can also ask a question in the chat. We also have the opportunity for some live dialogue questions. I see that some participants have already electronically raised their hand, and we'll call on folks in a minute. In the meantime, I'm going to start launching a poll that will allow us to engage in some polling of the group. So you'll see that pop up on your screen here, and we're going to get a sense of how you view the voting process. And so we'll just wait for some Q&As to come into the Q&A box here, and then soon we'll start calling on people who raise their hand electronically. And if you have trouble doing that, you can also just write a note in the chat or Q&A box, and we'll try and find you on the attendee list and select you to speak. So we have an attendee, Fian Hua, who has had their hand up, and I'm wondering if you're able to unmute. I have allowed you to unmute if you can, if you want to ask a question or make a comment. Are you seeing anything, Connie, in the Q&A or the chat that we can work with?
Sorry, I was muted. There was a question, how do we get past voting for the lesser of two evils when it's a two-party system?
Should I respond to that?
Please, Bill.
Okay. So let's start with your basic point about this is a two-party system, and as such, it is among the most undemocratic on the planet. And it makes it very difficult for minor parties to rise. And so what that ends up meaning is that the two major parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, are actually not really political parties, they're political alliances. And as such, you have to figure out what battleground you can operate in. And I come out of the tradition of believing that we working people should be operating both inside and outside of the Democratic Party. Because the Republican Party, in its overall messages and way of operating, has become a very hard right-wing party that is very opposed to working class issues and interests, very opposed to women, and very opposed to the environment, people of color. But it means, like I was saying at the end of my remarks, we got to be strategic about it. And that means not simply voting for people that we happen to like or think are the lesser of two evils, but particularly in the primaries, we should be advancing candidates. And we need to be building organizations. And this is one of the things that I've been pushing for a while, that there should be like working people's organizations that are operating within the Democratic Party, or running people, you know, in nonpartisan elections that represent our interests. And so that's where the fight, I think, should happen.
While you were speaking, I ran a poll on that very question as to whether folks have ever voted for a candidate only because the candidate was the lesser of two evils, and we've got a pretty good voter turnout. It's kind of interesting how these results shake out. I'll share them with you here now. Surprising number of people who actually have that happen quite frequently.
I wonder if I can, John, if it's okay if I just jump in, and I want to plug our Path to Power program, which is the program that we have. Thank you. The program that we have at the State Labor Council, where we recruit, train, and assist union members and community partners in running for office. This year, we have a slate of 6 Path to Power candidates that are all running for the legislature. These are all union members and community partners. That means that we don't have to educate them on our issues, right? They bring their values into the office with them. And I think only through recruiting our own to run for office will we be able to step away from, you know, this system that, you know, requires some of us to vote the lesser of the two evils.
Thank you. We have a question from Jim McKenzie in the Q&A. Can you expand on the tactic that the current President of the United States is using to eliminate vote by mail?
What he's doing is essentially the big lie. And because what he's doing, and it relates to the issue of white replacement, he is basically suggesting that there's a problem when there's not. Again, the documentation on mail-in voting is very clear. But as we've seen repeatedly with Trump, he's not going to let the facts get in the way of his opinion. And he's going to continue to reiterate his point. And this is one of the reasons that it's fruitless to argue with him. He has to be out-organized. I'll give you an example. There's something called the Flat Earth Society. They exist, the headquarters is in Britain. And literally, that is who they are. They believe that the earth is flat. 1960s, I remember, because I was really into space and all that. When one of the Gemini capsules went up, the Flat Earth Society sent a message of congratulations. They said, this is really great. And while it's true that what you're looking at looks like a sphere, we just want to say it's an optical illusion. We'll say, how do you argue with that? Right? I mean, when someone has completely embraced delusional thinking, how do you argue with that? The reality is that you can't. You can't argue Trump out of that. You have to out-organize him so that he is neutralized. And so when he's repeating that stuff, I actually think what we need to do, and I don't know why people aren't doing it, we need to actually laugh at him much more. People don't laugh at him. When he says stupid things, we should really, I mean, I'm not just talking about people like Stephen Colbert. I mean, like regular people should just like break into hysterics. Because when it is so completely lunatic, why do we take it seriously? Why do we try to argue as if we're arguing with a rational being when he's clearly saying the facts don't matter? You know, there was a great film Kenneth Branagh made called Conspiracy, and it was about the Wannsee meeting in Germany in 1942 when the final solution was planned. It's on HBO. I'd recommend anyone get it. One of the most gripping films I've ever seen. And there's a scene where one of the Nazis, they brought all these different department heads together, and Reinhard Heydrich is running the meeting. And one of the Nazis, Heydrich is saying, we have to exterminate the Jews. We're going to work this out. And so one of the Nazis says, you know, I was promised by the Fuhrer that that wouldn't happen. And Heydrich turns to him and he says, and he will continue to.
Yeah.
And right? And that's what we've got to understand.
Yeah. Jeremy Cody has a question.
Yeah, my question was, what do we do if voting is canceled due to the current administration and current pandemic that's going on?
Well, there's a few possibilities for what could happen in November. So I'm going to expand your question. So one thing is if it's canceled. The second thing is if Donald decides he doesn't like the outcome and decides not to go anywhere, right? And we have to be prepared for both of those. And why? Because basically in 2016, he said as much, that he wasn't necessarily going to go by the results. So if voting is canceled, there will immediately be litigation because the Constitution basically says you got to vote. So that will be one thing. I think in preparation for both possibilities, those of us that believe in democracy need to start building democracy brigades right now. We need to start getting volunteers from within our membership, our families and friends who are ready to mobilize in a moment's notice to make sure that voting is safe, that there are not armed right-wing groups, which is another possibility that is being raised, that there will be armed right-wing groups at voting places to supposedly make sure that illegals don't vote. We need to make sure that we are there and that we out-organize the other side. If the cancellation happens or if Donald loses and decides that he doesn't like the results, I think we have to be ready to shut the country down. Pure and simple. That nothing moves. Now, I think that one of the possibilities I've been watching very carefully is the military. And if you notice what the brass has been saying, both the retired and current, they are very uneasy with what's going on from the White House. And I suspect that if there's an attempt to break the Constitution, Trump is going to find he doesn't have the support of the military. He might have the support of armed right-wing groups, though.
So I noticed Henry Noble posed a question in the chat that isn't this the perfect time for the union movement to inaugurate a party to represent the workers, U.S. Labor Party?
No, bluntly. In the 1990s, a Labor Party was formed. My late friend and colleague, Tony Mazzocchi, was the main person leading that out of the oil, chemical, and atomic workers. And immediately they ran into several problems. One was, what does the Labor Party stand for? Being for a Labor Party doesn't necessarily mean that everyone agrees on its stance. There had been fascist Labor parties. So that's one of the issues. What does it stand for? The second thing that they were up against was whether the Labor Party would be a spoiler in partisan elections. If the Labor Party did not have sufficient votes in order to win, would people casting the votes for the Labor Party mean that the Republicans would always win? And so that becomes a second problem. And so that's why, in my opinion, it's not simply about calling for a Labor Party. That's why I think we need to build working people's organizations, political organizations that are not parties, but a party-like, L-I-K-E, not L-I-T-E, that basically can operate inside and outside of the Democratic Party, where we're running candidates and we're pushing these parties in much the same way that Bernie Sanders pushed the Democrats. Now, here's the other thing that we got to recognize. Bernie Sanders achieved approximately 40% of the vote up until the time that he withdrew. One of the things that points to is that the balance of forces is such that he did not have the majority. If we, Labor people and our allies, go off and set up another party. The reality is that we probably still have to come to some alliance with the Democrats in order to win. And if you look around the world, rarely do you find in an electoral context that one party wins by itself. When Lula ran in Brazil, for example, as the candidate of the Workers' Party in the early 2000s, he did not win. He did not run only for the Labor Party. There was a coalition with other parties. And that meant that when he won, he couldn't simply implement the program of the Labor Party, but he had to recognize the coalition. And that's one of the realities of our situation, outside of extraordinary circumstances.
So I'm going to shift the discussion just a little bit now. We had a question from Terry Mayette about voter apathy and how we practically, and I feel like others can jump in here as well, how we practically move those when there is apathy. And I'm going to, while we're talking this issue through, I'm going to run a couple of additional polls around this question around apathy and about getting out the vote. So the question again is, what to do about voter apathy, and what can we practically do in terms of getting out the vote?
In my opinion, in our union, I think that a lot of it centers around voter education. And if you don't have a voter education program to demonstrate to your members and their family members why it's important for them to turn out to vote, you're gonna have a problem with the election. So the other part of that is to have a very strong and orchestrated GOTV, get out the vote program as well. I think right now, today, this issue of racism, police corruption, it's brought all races together right now to demonstrate why we need change throughout this country. If people can't get excited, if you can't educate people about what's going on out there right now, and get them excited about turning out to vote, again, we have a problem. Typically, we don't go outside of our membership, at least when we use union funds to go out and educate one-on-one with our membership during these education sessions right before an election. I think it's incredibly important, and I know that 751 has a very strong education program out there that covers a lot more than just our membership. Like I said, family and friends, you got to get them excited. You have to educate folks, and you have to have a strong GOTV program.
So, I think Gary wants to add on.
Yeah,
Gary, if you have something, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to add, I think that we have to start talking in terms of issues that affect our membership and our lives. If you go into Republican or Democrat and you try to put a label on it, you lose half the group. So, let's think about it as workers and as union people and as Americans. And how does that benefit our society and our children and our grandchildren? That's the way we have to talk about politics in this country. They put us in a box to say, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, I'm a progressive, I'm a conservative. Those are just labels to divide us. So let's talk about the issues that affect us in our everyday lives and our working lives. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary.
So given that this group that attended this conference, as I think April or maybe Liz or both pointed out, are the true blue supporters here, I thought this poll result was very interesting, that there's at least 25% of those who are on the call who have either never or only once participated in voter turnout. So there is some opportunity here for some additional participation, certainly.
So I saw there was a question in the Q&A that I think John will probably want to answer, that Are we supposed to still support the same people in office that advised us to give up our pensions to keep Boeing in Washington State? Because we've heard that at lodge meetings since that happened.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And we handle that, we've handled that for the last 6 years. And, when we went through our last contract and, had politicians weigh in and say that they studied the issue and that they determined that the machinists must give up their pension so that everyone else can be successful. And many of those politicians were ones that we had worked for, we had doorbelled for, we had tried to help them get elected. When they turned on us and, reinforced that machinists have to sacrifice so that everyone else can be successful, we're not going to endorse those candidates anymore. And I know they say in politics you shouldn't have a long memory, but our members do. Our members will never forget those politicians that stood on the wrong side of this, and we won't be endorsing them. Now, when we go through this process to endorse candidates, we have a legislative committee that is from our elected district council and from our local lodges, and they talk to candidates about how they feel on labor issues, how they answer questions on labor issues. And those include discussions around pension. Those include discussions around right to work, bargaining rights. We see in some states where they're starting to limit bargaining rights. Anyone that will support limiting what unions have a right to bargain is something that we are going to oppose every single time. And so it's all wrapped into one big issue. And that's why we try to keep the issues narrow around working people's issues. Our members, as we all know, are from all parties, right? And we try to get people focused on what's better for us as workers, for our community as workers, as labor. And that's how we'll continue to measure the politicians that we support. I'd be happy to support any politician from any party that's going to stand up for unions and they're going to stand up for workers. And that's our stance on that going forward.
And there's another question. Would the privatization of the U.S. Postal Service have a negative effect on mail-in ballots? That's kind of thrown out there. A number could jump in on that.
Yes. I mean, it's very scary because that's exactly what could happen. And some people even worry that that's part of Trump's objective with strangling the Postal Service. I don't think that's his main objective though. There's been a long time effort by Republicans to privatize the Postal Service. And what often happens in crises is that the rich and the infamous can take advantage of it to move certain things that they couldn't win otherwise. I think that's what they're trying to do with the Postal Service.
And then let's see, are the unions in America putting pressure on the police unions to police their own?
We've faced that issue here in our community. And there's a big debate going on around defunding the police. And I know there's a lot of passionate voices on all sides. I know that there's an effort to change what police unions have a right to bargain with their employer. I will tell you that our stance as a union is that we oppose racism. We oppose police brutality. We support accountability measures and training, and we support adding resources to add classifications that might be better suited in certain situations addressing our community. This union has a hard time trying to tell another labor organization what they'll be able to bargain for their members. It's happened to us, and we know how District 751 felt about that, and it makes it hard to tell someone else what they need to bargain for their members. But we will stand against racism, we will stand against police brutality, and that's kind of our stance on that.
Sorry,
let me just say that currently, you know, the machinists represent about 11 different bargaining units that are police officers. A lot of them, some of them are mechanics within the police department. Some of them don't have the right to handcuff people. But we're in a discussion right now at the AFL-CIO about how we're addressing these issues with folks that represent bargaining units where people that put the cuffs on people, you know, how are we going to impact that conversation? And, you know, as April knows, they are starting to hold sessions on racial discrimination when it comes to this. And I would encourage all of our members up in Puget Sound and across the country to go to those CLC meetings and become part of that conversation. But we have a meeting actually next week about these bargaining units where unions represent these different bargaining units. So more to come on that.
And, oh, I think April's going to weigh in.
Well, I was just going to lift up, thank you, President Martinez, and thank you, President Holden, for your words around this. I think it is really easy in this moment to look at the police unions and lay blame at the feet of the unions, but I think that ignores the systemic and institutional problem of racism that we have in this country. And that if we truly believe that all workers deserve the right to a union and the right to collectively bargain, then we have an obligation, I think, to work with our police unions and our guilds and our public safety unions to provide them with the tools and the resources they need so they can work on institutional and systemic racism as a first step before we move to a conversation, other accountability conversations around what solidarity looks like for all of us in our movement at this time.
Thanks, April. Okay.
Oh, you want to?
You got some other questions? I do want to get to Chelsea's call to action, but we can take another question.
So it was, how do we change the association that labor or unions are socialist or communist interests?
You won't be able to, because the reality is that since the 19th century, the rich and the infamous have always accused any worker that ever organized of being a syndicalist, a communist, a socialist, a troublemaker, whatever. And the reality is that our unions represent a broad cross-section of views, religions, politics, etc. And the fundamental issue is that the rich and the infamous do not want workers to organize. That's the bottom line. And again, it's like you can't convince someone that believes that the earth is flat, that the earth is round. And those that are going to throw around red baiting, which has always been used to undermine worker organization, they're going to continue to until we out-organize them and basically shut them up.
Okay. All right. I would like to ask Chelsea to go through her piece now. I appreciate everyone and their questions, and I know there's a lot, we could spend a lot more time on this, and we do have more time today as well, but Chelsea, why don't you go ahead?
Sure, yeah, good afternoon, District 751. My name is Chelsea Mason. I'm the Legislative and Political Director for IAM District 751. This has been such an inspiring and thought-provoking afternoon. I'm going to talk about how we can turn this inspiration into action, beginning now until Election Day, which centers on the Get Out the Vote and Labor Neighbor efforts that have already been mentioned. I've been with the machinists for a little over a year. What I've learned and been most impressed by is that our members are incredibly generous, caring, engaged, and deeply rooted in the community. The nature of Machinist members is to give back, make a difference, and fiercely defend working people. I'm going to ask you to bring that spirit to our political program in ways and at levels you never have before. We need a grassroots political army for workers and unions to win in 2020. We need members willing to give up a Saturday or an evening to register people to vote, make calls, knock on doors, hopefully, leaflet, send postcards, host gatherings, and whatever else campaigns are doing to reach voters in this brave new world. We need to awaken union members that don't yet appreciate how important this election is and how powerful and hard fought for many, their vote is. When union members vote, we can swing elections. It's on us, though, to get out there and talk to working people about what candidates are going to be their champions and what candidates will side with corporate interests and settle for unjust and equitable systems every time. So I ask you to sign our IAM Action Pledge 2020. There are IAM 751 members and retirees in literally every legislative district in our state. Imagine the muscle we have to flex in this campaign. Signing the pledge tells us we can call on you to give even a small amount of time to collectively make a huge difference in who gets elected in November. As we fight for healthy communities, economic recovery, and racial justice, it's arguably never been so important that we have the right people leading our state and country. So the link to the IAM Action Pledge is going to be posted in the chat area of the meeting. I'm going to check to see if it's there. Yeah.
Hold on, I'm having some issues. It wasn't coming through as a link, so give me a minute and it will.
Okay. I could also do it, Connie, if you need me to. So it might be an awkward 30 seconds, but I'd like to actually, once the link is there, actually just pause and let folks open the pledge. It's super quick. Really just ask for your contact information and tells us that you're willing to be part of that army that gets the right people elected in November.
I'm also launching a poll.
Okay, can you share it, Chelsea? It doesn't come through as a link when I put it in.
Yeah.
And I've got a poll going to ask if you're ready to get going here and help out.
Awesome. Let's see here. Oh, you know what? It's not going to come through. Okay, 1 second here. I got the real link.
You're fine. We do.
We were trying to rename it and that didn't work.
Yeah. All right. Let's see if this works. All righty, so again, in the chat area, hopefully went to everyone. There's a link, Question Pro, a long link there. If everyone could take a minute and open that link and sign the pledge, and then we are building our troops that will engage at Labor Neighbor, get out the vote, working with other unions, working with other members, and we will do everything we can between now and Election Day to get union members and workers engaged. So I will pause. Okay, thank you all very much. My final call to action is to ask you to look for your union's candidate endorsements in the next Aero Mechanic. Your legislative committee works extremely hard, as John mentioned, to interview and vet candidates. We only endorse candidates who unwaveringly support workers' rights to collectively bargain. We can't afford to have anyone in office who doesn't, because that right is too valuable and too vulnerable. Fortunately, many strong candidates this year don't just support unions, they are rank and file union members, as April mentioned as well, and they need our help to get elected. So with that said, thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you at a virtual campaign event soon, maybe a really big in-person one soon as well. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thanks, Chelsea. Okay, I have some closing remarks before we get into our, we're going to take a break after this and we'll open up again with Bill Fletcher on what's happening currently. But it's really important to me to kind of talk about what's happening in our community and, you know, what's happened with the killing of George Floyd by the police in Minneapolis. You know, the nation has been torn by this, and you know, we're seeing our citizens here in our community and across the country step up and say that enough is enough, that protesters are bringing a message that killings like what happened to George Floyd should never happen again. And they are attempting to deliver this peacefully, even as some try to weaken it with destruction and violence. So the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to address generations of systemic racism and bias against Black people. Some may counter this message, and I've seen it here on chat, that all lives matter. And of course, all lives matter, that's true. But this message that Black Lives Matter is putting out there is meant to address those that don't accept this basic truth. We must stand with our brothers and sisters in the Black community who are making this statement, because there are those that simply don't believe Black Lives Matter. The IAM stands against racism. We work every day to fight for fairness and equality for everyone, and against racism or discrimination of any kind. We fight to provide rights in the workplace that every single person deserves, no matter their skin color, their race, their gender, their religion, sexual orientation, or anything else. As a labor union, District 751 will continue to fight for fairness and equality. We will fight against poverty. We will fight against racism of any kind. Our members benefit from a union contract that provides equality and fairness, where opportunities are available for everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from. We believe all people deserve these same rights, and this is where our focus will remain. IAM 751 will continue to provide the opportunity for workers in our community to join and benefit from union representation. We know that when workers have the right to bargain, when people have the right to bargain, when they have the ability to self-determine what is important to them and actually negotiate that with their employer, then we're going to be better off, and we're going to raise the standard of living for everyone. And that's what this union will focus on. Together with our community partners, we'll stand up for equality, for fairness, and we'll provide advocacy for members in our community that need it the most. And indeed, Black lives do matter. So I appreciate you all attending today. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and we're going to come back on with Bill Fletcher to kind of talk more about and have a further discussion about what we're seeing happen in the current environment today. So thank you, and hang in there.
Away everything and make everybody feel high. But if you know what your life is worth, you would look for yours on earth. So know you see the light. I'm begging you to stand up for your right. Oh, yo, say get up, stand up. Make your head stand up for your right. Come on, say get up, stand up. No, no, don't give up the fight. I beg your head, get up, stand up. Come on, stand up for your right. Get up, stand up. Don't give up the fight.
We're sick inside of your ism, schism, games, dying and go to heaven in Jesus' name, Lord.
We know where we understand. My God is the living man. You can fool some people sometimes, but you can't fool all the people all the time. Say, now you see the light. What you gonna do? Stand up for your rights. Oh yeah. Get up, stand up. Stand up for your rights. You got to get up, stand up. Don't give up the fight. Fear is the enemy. Get up, stand up. Stand up for your rights. Get up, stand up. Don't give up the fight. Never 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 give up the fight. Don't give it up. Never give up the fight. 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 Don't you ever never give up the fight. Won't you ever never give up the fight.
And unjust laws cannot defeat us.
life today. If I don't get some shelter, oh yeah, I'm gonna fade away. Oh, children, it's just a shot away. It's just a shot away. Oh, children, woo. It's just a shot away. 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 Give it love my brother. It's just a kiss away. It's just a kiss away. Give it love my brother. It's just a kiss away. 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 It's just some love away. Let's give some love away. Let's give some love away. Let's give some love away. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. Spencer, thanks for playing those songs during the break there. We're going to go ahead and move into our next part. And this is really to allow us to really talk about what's happening in our community today across the country. There's a lot of strong emotions and feelings, and I am grateful that Brother Bill Fletcher offered to provide these discussion points and take us into this discussion. So with that, Bill, please take it away.
Okay, thank you. What I wanted to do is offer a few opening remarks, and then I'm hoping that people will jump in with questions, comments. And while I'm talking, one of the things that I'd like you all to be thinking about is, what were you thinking and what did you feel when you saw or heard about the murder of George Floyd? And perhaps we can really get into that, and with an aim ultimately of discussing, what does this mean for unions? What does this mean for the labor movement? I wanted to, though, kick off with something that John started talking about, and I appreciated it. And it has to do with this notion of Black Lives Matter and the pushback that has come from certain quarters when people will say all lives matter or blue lives matter or whatever. And I think what's important to recognize is that this slogan arose as an affirmation of our legitimacy as people. And it was basically saying that in the United States, our lives don't matter. Indeed, the lives of Native Americans don't matter. If you look at the statistics about who was killed by proportion, disproportionately Native Americans, more than anyone else. If every life mattered in this country, we would have recognized that the opioid epidemic did not start a few years ago when Miss Ann from Southern Indiana with her blonde hair died. We would have understood that the opioid crisis has been with us since the introduction of heroin. But as long as the opioid crisis was contained in African American and Latino communities, it was not considered a crisis. It was considered a recognition of our failings as people, we meaning African Americans and Latinos, that our lack of morality, our lack of being close to God, whatever. But when Miss Ann died, then it became a crisis. And Miss Ann's life mattered. Our lives didn't. In Minneapolis, there were 2 court cases, and I'm not talking about Floyd, that really demonstrate this. There was a man named Castillo who was stopped by the police. He had a permit to carry a gun, pistol. The police approach him. He moves to explain that he has a gun, he has a legitimate right to have it, and he gets killed. And within a year of that, a woman, Justine Damon, white woman, was shot and killed by the police after she reported to the police a problem. The police showed up, a black cop, shot and killed her. The black cop is in jail, probably be there forever. The guy that killed Castillo, no, wasn't murder. So when we talk about Black Lives Matter, that's what we're talking about, that there's in fact a differential in treatment that permeates society. You see it, one of the ways that I've thought about it on a planetary scale is, which goes beyond black, but you could say black and brown, is the tsunami that hit southern Asia in, I think, 2006. And millions of people were killed. But in order for the media to talk about the devastation of it, they focused on the deaths of a few thousand Swedes who happened to be visiting Thailand. Now, look, I have nothing against Sweden. Great people, great social system, but there were millions of people dying in Myanmar, Indonesia, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, India, Somalia, Kenya. Why did we need to focus on the death of a few thousand Swedes in order to make the point of this disaster? Because our lives don't matter. So when people are raising this issue of Black Lives Matter, this is not saying that our lives matter more than someone else's. It's a statement of fact. Our lives matter, they should matter. And I think one of the things that happened very graphically with regard to the Floyd case was that this man is killed with a policeman keeping his knee on his neck, these other cops standing by as if they were waiting for a hot dog salesman to bring some hot dogs by. Not one stepping forward and saying, hey man, get your damn knee off of his neck. But see, if our lives don't matter, then, or if you really think at the end of the day that nothing is going to happen to you, then it's no crisis. And so the discussion that's going on in this country around police brutality, about race, about restructuring police, et cetera, is really rooted in the history of this country. And we don't have time to get into the full-blown part of it, but it's covered in the educational that the Washington State Labor Council has. And I would encourage you to use it, because we have to have that discussion, which leads to my final point. This discussion about race is always dicey. It is always one that where there's landmines all over the place. And there's a lot of pain. And there's a pain which those of us of color go through when we're reminded of things, when we're reminded of lynchings, when we see imprinted in our minds the murder of George Floyd or the murder of Emmett Till. There's, those that have memories of what the Texas Rangers and Arizona Rangers did to Mexicans and Chicanos. What happened to the Native Americans. So that's part of the pain whenever this comes up. But there's a pain that whites face. It's a different kind of pain because one of the problems that frequently happens is that many whites become very defensive and are immediately worried that they're being personally attacked. And I've been in very few discussions where there is any kind of personal attack, but there is a request that comes from us that you look at history and that you understand what we're going through. And that you don't try to brush it off by saying that was the past. Let's move forward. But also recognize that your ancestors were played for suckers. And I think that's probably the biggest pain, to recognize that the ancestors of Europeans who were settlers here were played for suckers by the rich, and very successfully, much in the same way that the English played the Scots and the Welsh and the poor English, the suckers when they brought them over to Ireland in order to settle. They convinced them that they had more in common with the British Crown, no matter how poor they were, than they were with the Irish farmers. And the rich and the infamous here have done much the same thing. That's part of what we have to discuss. So yes, all lives do matter, or all lives should matter. But until all lives in practice matters, we have to remind people that, for example, the possible annihilation of entire tribes of Native Americans as we sit here right now, because of the COVID-19 crisis, the entire annihilation matters. And damn it, we should do something about it. And not just start saying, oh, that's really too bad, pass the ketchup. If their lives matter, then damn it, you got to do something. Because silence means complicity. You know, in World War II, after World War II, there's a story that I heard many times about this young German woman who asked her elders, what were you doing when the Nazis picked up the Jews? And the communists and the social and trade unionists. But she focused on the Jews. And they said, we didn't know. We didn't know what was happening. She looked at them and said, you know what was happening. You knew as much as you wanted to know. And that's where it's interesting, because silence means complicity. It means that you're accepting that. So if all lives matter, or at least they should, then that means that the trade union movement needs to speak up every time there's an atrocity. Every time. As opposed to saying, well, that's a Black issue. That's a Chicano issue, or Native Americans, or Asians. Anytime the President of the United States starts attacking Asians and suggesting that China is the source of COVID, right? And playing that up, knowing full well that his supporters use that to then demonize Asians, we need to speak up. Because look, folks, I hate to break this to you, but the so-called Spanish flu of 1918 to 20, it didn't start in Spain, it started in the United States. 50 million people on this planet died as a result of something starting in the United States. And has the United States ever taken responsibility for that? No. We couldn't help that it started in the United States. So why, if we couldn't help it start in the United States, why would we focus on the Chinese? with the start of COVID. It's a planetary problem. So when the President of the United States makes use of it for demonic political reasons, every union in this country should be denouncing him and denouncing anyone that articulates that. And then we will know that all lives matter. I'm going to stop there. So we have, what, John, about an hour?
Yeah, we have about an hour to kind of do some Q&A and want to offer people the opportunity to weigh in. So much like we kind of just went through, you know, I'm going to ask Connie and Spencer to try and work through that.
Again, if you have a question that you'd like to ask verbally, we can do that. And for example, Navy Harold, you've raised your hand. If you'd like to speak now, you can. You may need to unmute yourself.
Sorry,
Okay.
I accidentally
there you are.
put my hand on it. I do
Okay.
not have any question.
Okay, no worries. It's a question from Rick Olson about the way in which right to work has an effect on elections and racism.
That's a fascinating question.
I thought so too.
Yeah, no, it really is, because it relates in a lot of ways to the way that voter disenfranchisement was passed in the South. As you remember when I said earlier that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the rich plantation owners and their supporters were able to move voter disenfranchisement by claiming that it was a way of protecting white folks. The architects of right to work did exactly the same thing beginning in Texas after World War II. And they basically, beginning in the Southwest and then moving into the Southeast, they articulated that right to work was a way of protecting white people from being forced, those were their words, to be in the same organizations with people of color. And they used, let's say, less flattering terms for people of color. So so they basically made the argument for right to work was made, believe it or not, on a white supremacist basis. Now, over time, it's become much more sophisticated. Right to work consolidated in the South and the Southwest, and then like a cancer started moving north. And when it started moving north, it was being advanced as a more libertarian issue, that somehow right to work freed up workers from the alleged obligation of union membership. And, you know, it's interesting because the right to work forces were never able to deal with this argument of what city or town do you know of where taxes are voluntary, yet people get free education, police, fire, water. Now, if you know of any such town, please put it in the chat. I want to know. I've been doing a survey around this country and have yet to find such a place. So, but when we talk about a union representing the interests of the bargaining unit, then these right to work people say, no, 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 you shouldn't have to pay anything, but you benefit. There's no other institution in this country that falls under those rules. And I think we need to push back on that.
Makes sense. Christopher Mack, did you have a question? You'd have to unmute, I think. Seeing anything in the questions, Connie?
Spencer, can I ask a question?
Comments.
Oh, you're there?
I just want to ask a question.
Yeah.
I want to ask a question to everybody on this, which I asked before. I'm really curious, and if you don't want to put everybody, you can just send it to me, right? What did you feel and think if you saw the murder of George Floyd, or when you heard about it? I'm just really curious how it has affected people, because I know how it affected me. And when I see some people write some stuff up there, I'll tell you how it affected me, but I don't want to bias everybody.
Yeah, if anyone wants to speak to that, just raise your hand electronically or make a note in the chat or Q&A, and we'll do our best to get to you. And
a lot of people are putting it in the chat, so.
Princey, I think
Princey's got her hand up.
Go ahead, Princey.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So like I've shared with some of my leadership before, being a Black female, watching that, to me, it was a public lynching. And because I looked at it as a public lynching after seeing a lot of other things happening with us within the Black community, to me, when I looked at it, same thing I've shared before, I looked at it as the policeman saying, look what I'm doing. I'm letting all you Blacks know this is what we can do. It doesn't matter if you're videotaping us. We all walk out of the court system. We all go back to our jobs on Monday morning. And they have not lost anything. But being part of a Black family, this is something that we're all watching on TV, and all of us are saying, see, they're letting us know what they can get away with, because majority of them have walked out of that court system and went on with their lives, where the Black families were burying their family member, whether it be their child. You know, Blacks have been shot, killed on their own property, minding their business. But then when it's time to go to court, these police officers, and I'm not talking about all police officers, there are some good policemen out there, but you have quite a few that feel that as long as they have that badge and that gun, they can do whatever they want out there on the street. And these are people that, when I was in elementary school, would come into the school system, and your teachers will introduce you to this police officer, telling us this is somebody who we can trust. This is someone who we can call if we have a problem, and they'll come and help us, or they'll be there for us. So don't be afraid. Well, being a small Black kid, and that police officer would come into the class, I would just stare at him, because all I could think about is all the things that I've seen them do to people that look like me. I could not look at them as somebody who I can trust. I was scared of them because of that big gun I saw and that badge. And like I just said, watching them do what they want to do out there in the Black community. They are supposed to protect Black folks out there. If they're in the community, then you need to be a people person. If you're afraid of Blacks, then you don't need to be a police officer in those communities. You know, you're supposed to be there helping. If I call you, I want you to come with an open mind and ask me what's going on. I don't need you to come onto my property after I called you to come and help me. And then you start judging me or talking to me like I'm the criminal just because I'm the Black person that called you. My taxes pay your wages. My taxes pay your retirement. You think I feel comfortable with helping you make a living and also retire gracefully after you've come into my community and terrorized it? There's a lot of Black cops out here too that terrorize their community, but they're doing it side by side with their brothers in blue. But like I said, there are some good police officers out there, but there are some out there that really need some help. And I feel that a lot of them need to have some kind of test before they even get that gun or that badge in their hands. Some of them get those jobs because it gives them an excuse to do what they want to do. Hey, I got a badge and a gun. If I shoot this person running away from me, and then I'm gonna write in the paper, oh, they were aggressive to me, I was scared. How the hell are you gonna be scared of someone that's running from you? And you're gonna shoot them in the back. That is ridiculous. So yeah, I took it very personal when I watched that murder on TV. Especially when they show that guy, that police officer's face every time that man said he could not breathe. He put more of his weight on that man's neck. I cried watching that. Just like I've cried watching other murders of other Black people being murdered right in front of our faces, right on video. I cry every time cops were released out of the system, walking out with smiles on their faces after they committed murder. I don't want people to think just because people got murdered, they actually did something. There are some good and bad people on all sides of this world. But come on. Every Black person that does something need to be, you know, like being pulled over. Why does it take 15 cops to pull over one Black person? Like I've shared before, it's because they're letting the community know we're all here. All 15 of us are here just to get in on this. We all want to be part of this. It's ridiculous. It's like they're making a clown show out there. Like it's a damn circus. It's embarrassing. And it hurts. Or watching cops beat up kids like they're grown men, punching girls in their faces. There's a lot of stuff going on out here that people don't really know because it doesn't affect your life.
Can I just suggest that we really appreciate this? I think we should try to get some additional voices in this.
That sounds fair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Quincy.
Okay, I think we had
Chris.
Oh, go ahead, Tony.
Christy Kidrick, she's got her hand up.
Hello, everyone. Hey, I had the opportunity to be involved with a rally in Marysville earlier this week, and it was really nice to be there with my brothers and sisters, supporting everything that's going on in our community. But I know that we are really good at promoting solidarity within the ranks at work. And what is the opportunity, or will there be more involvement, or can there be more involvement with the union supporting our communities in some of these rallies that are going on all over the Puget Sound area, so that we could also let the communities know that our solidarity stretches further and more supportive than just where we work at, and getting out to those communities as a larger group of union members to let the communities know that we're in support of them and we stand with them.
Yes, thanks, Christy. We, we did offer it up to stewards to be excused to go attend up in Marysville and to lay up the march, and we can try to advertise. There's been so much happening in Seattle, I think daily, that there wasn't anything to advertise other than what's happening. There are some events on June 19th, Juneteenth, that are happening from the waterfront up to, I believe, the courthouse. Maybe Richard can speak on that.
Yeah, there's actually a couple of different marches going on, sponsored by both Africatown and also the Longshore Union. So one starts at 10 a.m. and we'll march from Pier 46, I believe it is, to one of the halfway houses on 4th Avenue, I believe it is, in downtown Seattle. And then from there, then we go to the City Hall. And then there's another one later in the afternoon at 23rd and Union. There's some flyers, and I can send anybody that wants them, I can send the flyers out to you. I have both, so.
Thanks, Richard.
We also have some signs made up too, possibly. Is that something we could look at as well?
We do have signs available that say Machinist Union supports you that we use in our support marches or rallies. So I believe we have some at the Everett Hall and the Seattle Hall. But wherever you're heading and you need some, we'll make sure you get some.
Awesome. Thank you very much, you guys. I appreciate it.
I see Gurdon has his hand up as well. Did you want to unmute yourself and talk, Gurdon? Maybe not.
Okay. Does anybody else want to raise their hand, or do we have any in the Q&A?
Not seeing a lot.
Hey, I just finally figured out how to unmute. There was a little thing there that let me unmute.
Go ahead, Gurdon.
Thank you. So, you know, you hear a lot about this defund the police movement, and you hear, just at work, you hear all the folks, you know, they're anti this, right? They're just anti. I think it's the slogan itself, the defund the police. And what I believe, what we really are talking about is the police need to de-escalate the situations when they're called in. You know, I also watched some other show where they train police in Scotland how to de-escalate instead of go in and, you know, you always have the gun on the side of your you know, on your side, and you could and that's how all these killings and stuff seem to happen. Although this last one I thought was awful, but I mean, it was even worse. I'd rather be shot than choked to death. But I just wanted your thoughts on that, Bill. Could you help me out on any of that? Thank you. Now I can somehow unmute or mute.
Sure. So I think that the issue of defund the police or abolish the police is a slogan that emerged out of fury as a result of these lynchings that we've recently seen. I think that the real content is about restructuring and rethinking. And it speaks to one of the things that you're raising. It's rethinking, what do we mean by policing? And restructuring, I believe the police need to be demilitarized. And that what we've seen for the last 50 years has been an increased militarization of police departments, leading to a situation where the police department started to be provided with surplus equipment from the US military.
That's right, yeah.
And the problem is that when you have that, it creates a certain climate. You know, it's sort of like they say, if you're a hammer, everything is a nail. If you're looking at everything through a particular lens, a military lens, and these constant references to a war on this, a war on that, you know, it was like the war on drugs, war on crime, etc. It basically builds this atmosphere where the assumption is, because this is how it is in a war, that there is an enemy that needs to be taken down one way or the other, as opposed to dealing with a social problem. And so I think that there needs to be this real rethinking about how do we respond to crises. Now, I'll be very clear. A few years ago, my daughter was held up at gunpoint. And my position, and I've said this and it's made some people uncomfortable, is that if a cop put a bullet in that person's head, wouldn't bother me at all. I wouldn't have had any trouble sleeping.
Right.
But that was in a very specific circumstance, right? But all too often you have a situation where there's homeless people that are being moved away and the cops show up with guns or tasers, or there's a family dispute. And again, they show up with guns or tasers. We have to have a different approach. And I really think that's what this moment is calling for.
True. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
Not seeing any hands raised. I think we've worked through them.
Okay, I would offer last opportunity for any of the panelists to wrap up. Bob, Gary, April, you have any desires to offer something?
Yeah, thank you, John. First of all, again, I want to thank everyone, especially the leadership, for inviting me to participate, listen to our membership and what their concerns are. Brother Fletcher, I appreciate your wisdom, your knowledge, and your opinion. I got to tell you, John, I'm extremely proud of District 751 and the membership, the district leadership, the local lodge leadership of all your locals. For you holding this kind of forum where our members, our leaders can come out and speak with professionals like Bill and others on the panel to start to air this out, to get this out in the open where different people can hear. Bill, what came to my mind when you asked for the opinion about what your feelings were when you saw that image or that reality, I thought about my grandson. My daughter is married to an African American, and I thought, is my grandson going to have to go through this 10, 15 years down the line, this same bullshit, this racial discrimination? When is this going to end? When is this going to end? And what my daughter would be thinking and what she was thinking when all this was going on, it was very disheartening. It was terrible. And I commit to our membership that this organization, again, will never, ever tolerate discrimination, racism, or anything else in this vein. And again, John, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Bob. We appreciate so much that you could be with us today. Gary.
Yeah, John, I just want to thank everybody for attending today. This is a great forum. I've been watching the comments here on the side. I want to thank Bill Fletcher for his insight and his keen intellect. I just want to say one thing. This union has reformed itself over the years. 1948, we took away the color bar. Until 1948, you could not be a member of this union unless you were a white male. We took that away in 1948. We resolved ourselves. And my point is that all of us have biases that we deal with on a daily basis. I'm a Chicano, Mexican-American, Latino, whatever you want to call me, but I have a white last name. My descent comes from Irishmen. And I can tell you, no one has a corner on biases or bigotry. I was stuck in the middle. I wasn't Hispanic, and I was brown, so I didn't get accepted by either side. So I saw firsthand what it was to be on the outside. And I just want you all to know that we have to all do a self-analysis and think about how we interact with each other and how we proactively change this. When I first saw that video, I was enraged, as I said on the comment. And then I got completely, profoundly sad because this happens too often in America. It's too often. Thank God we have video cameras in these phones now, and that's our defense. And, you know, and the last thing, I don't want to paint a brush that all cops are bad or all, they have a terrible, crappy job. There is no doubt about it. But we have some institutionalized, systemic racism in our systems that need to be eradicated forever and ever. This is America, and we need to make sure that our ideals live on and that we are all equal. And that's what this union is fighting for. If you look at our pattern and our history, we're not perfect, but we're better than we used to be. Right now, we have leadership at every level that reflects the diversity of our union. And I'm proud of our union, and I'm proud of John and his leadership for putting this conference on. I think it was spectacular, and I thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. April, do you have any final words for us?
Well, first I just want to thank you, John, and thank you, Susan, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. Thank you to all the other leaders that were a part of the panel. President Martinez, Vice President Gary Allen, Bill Fletcher, you're always wise and candid. Comments are always appreciated. I think, you know, there's nothing easy about these conversations. But the fact that you had more than 200 rank and file members and leaders spend their Saturday afternoon talking about not only their right, but their obligation and their duty to vote, as well as our collective duty to make our movement stronger and better, fills me with hope and gratitude. And I know that convening this space and putting on this conference wasn't easy, but I really appreciate your leadership at this time and appreciate the opportunity to do this work with all of you. So thank you.
Thanks, April. Appreciate it. You know, one of our reps, Andre Trahan, has raised his hand, and if I'd like to give him the opportunity to speak if he'd like.
Hey, Bill, this is Andre Trahan. I just wanted to give you the answer to your question from me. I kind of held off on even watching the video. I had family members that told me about it and everything, and I hadn't got a chance to see it. And when I finally did, I can say that of my knowledge, I've only cried 4 times in my life. Once was when I lost my daughter. Once was when we got screwed over on a contract. Another time was when I woke up in the morning and realized that Donald Trump was our president. And this last time was when I watched that video. And I mean, I couldn't help it. It was hard to see someone's eyes alive with gleam while someone else's eyes turn dark. It's something I get emotional when I even try and talk about it now. But it was just one more thing that showed me that I think we kind of got fooled a little bit as time went on. When the Reverend Martin Luther King said he had a dream and we started seeing changes happening, it's like we started to believe that maybe we had attained that dream and maybe we were making changes in the country and maybe changes in the world, that it was more equal, not just for Blacks, not just for Latinos or Chicanos, but for everybody. And the last couple of years has just shown that we're way further away from that dream than a lot of us may have thought we were. And, you know, I thought about raising my hand or not, or whether or not I wanted to get deep into this, because it's really an emotional issue for me. It's really something that starts to occupy every day. After I saw the video and I was in shock, and then the tears, then came the anger. And it was an anger that just wanted to destroy everything in its path. And luckily I talked with some people. I talked with Richard. I talked with John. about it and everything, and was able to pull that anger back, because it's not the right thing to go out there and just start giving that anger to everybody and destroying everything in your path. You have to be intelligent about it. You have to sit down and you have to come up with a strategy that's going to work to get you through this and maybe educate everybody else. And really, that's all I have to say. That's how it affected me.
Thank you.
Thanks, brother.
Thank you.
So I see there's a member that has his hand up too. Henry Natardi.
So I just have a quick question from our, I'm a white male, and I was at the casino last night, and I just have a question on the racism issue. I was sitting there, and the security guards came up to an African-American man and his wife, and they were drinking coffee, and the security guards told them they had to wear their masks. And there was a bunch of white kids, probably in their mid-20s. None of them had their masks on, and they didn't say a word to them. So the African-American guy and the white gal, his wife, got up and left. And so I called the head of security over, and I said, hey, I want to know why your security guard didn't say anything to the white kids, but they said something to this African-American guy and his wife. Well, we do the best we can. So do you guys consider that racism, or do you, I mean, I guess I'm confused by what he said. The security's doing the best job they can. They were standing 6 feet away from each other, these two groups. So I don't know. I guess I don't know if that's a dumb question or not, but I just would like your guys' opinion. Does that make sense to you guys?
It's not a dumb question, and there are no stupid questions. But this particular question is definitely not dumb at all. I would say yes. And the thing about the way race plays itself out is that it doesn't have to be conscious. There really are things that are called microaggressions that are subconscious. Just a simple example. It is not uncommon for me to hold the door when I'm exiting a building, and for a white person who will walk by and their eyes, I can tell they don't see me. They don't say thank you. They don't acknowledge it. But I realize they don't see me. I'm invisible. But
Bill,
paradoxically, right?
Too. I get that as a white male too.
Right, but see, I guess the thing is, all of these things can happen to individuals. That's true. But when you start to see a pattern, that's what you look for. Where is the pattern? And so, for example, with police violence, who is it that has to really think about where they're driving and what it means when a police car pulls up behind them? I get really nervous. So I think that the incident you described, yeah, I think it was racial. And I can also believe that the security guard wasn't conscious of it at all. Wasn't conscious of it at all. But that doesn't make it any less important. I think your question to them was exactly right. And for them to say, we do the best they can, no, that doesn't work. Why didn't you see these folks?
After the head of security was there, the people were still standing there, the white people, and he didn't even ask them to put their mask on after. I mean, it was just like, they were still standing there, and it's just like, oh my God. And everyone around me was like, they couldn't believe that this was going on.
Right.
It was just flabbergasting to everyone. I mean, it's just the social distancing, number one, and then they asked the black guy and his wife, who was white. Right. I don't know. Anyway,
Henry, I appreciate you bringing that up, and I think you're bringing up a solid example of what demonstrates systemic racism and is prevalent in other areas as well. So thank you for bringing that up. I wanted to see if we had any of other of our panelists have the opportunity. Susan, do you have any words for the group?
I just want to thank all the membership who took their Saturday to be with us today. Such an important issue. So thank you. I think everybody learned a lot. Thanks.
Thanks, Sue. Chelsea.
I would just also say thank you, and I'm so moved, and there's so much that I really have gained from this, and so it was the best way to spend a Saturday afternoon. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Chelsea. Richard.
I would just echo that and say thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you especially to Susan Palmer, our District Secretary-Treasurer, and John Holden for holding this and for initiating this for all of us to come together and talk about this. And as I was listening, I started thinking, Chelsea had this call to action. And I'm wondering, and this might seem silly, but over the years, change has only happened because a lot of other people have come together to make that happen. And it was through legislation, through the marches over the years, but it didn't happen until everybody kind of came together and pushed for those changes. And so I just hoping that there is some call to action, and I think there has been already, but just like Henry, what he said and did, and questioning, the security officer. Just imagine if millions started questioning, maybe we would actually get somewhere.
Thanks, Richard. I just want to, when I say my thanks here, I really appreciate everyone participating. I've spent the last couple weeks talking with, those close to me here at work, my family, my wife, my kids. And I've needed all that to get through this. My conversations, with Richard and Dan, with Andre, have helped me get through these types of things. And I just know that, as we move through this, when we stick with our principles, when we know that our union will stand on the side of people and we will stand on the side of justice and equality, then we're going to be okay. So I want to thank all the members for attending. You're why we're doing this, and we are all better off by having this discussion. No matter where we're at within this, we're all better off for having this discussion. And really want to thank one last time Bill Fletcher for your wisdom in this, April Sims for being with us here today and all your story. Gary Allen, thank you for your support throughout this whole entire process. And International President Bob Martinez, thank you. Means a lot that you are here with us today. So with that, I have nothing else to say, but thanks. So have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.